Hello, Sublation listeners, viewers, readers. I'm here with James Vaughn. My name is Clint. And last week, Doug interviewed James on the American Revolution. And they spent a lot of time sort of peeling back a lot of the baggage, a lot of the layers of progressivism that a lot of people naturally assume from the 20th century when we try to recover this revolutionary history. So we're doing a follow-up, and we're going to do a deep dive into the revolutionary society, enlightenment, politics that socialists and Marxists once took for granted, and that has subsequently been obscured by a progressive liberal historiography and politics. So that's just a little bit of context, obviously for the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So to start things off, James, the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, in a way the first truly world war between the revolutionary parliamentary state in Britain and Bourbon Catholic French monarchy. With the victory by the British, in what sense was this victory a victory for the revolution of and for society?
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there. I think that the point you begin with is an excellent one, which is that the 7 Years' War, or what is called in this country the French and Indian War, should not be seen simply as a geopolitical or great power struggle between Bourbon France, the France of Louis XV, or and Hanoverian Britain, the Great Britain of King George II and latterly King George III, but rather it had within it a kind of a political and ideological struggle as well, which is to say that Bourbon France was the perfection of a form of government, an old regime style of politics, absolute monarchy. And it included an absolute monarchy, an authoritarian government, religious monopoly of the Roman Catholic Church and religious repression and persecution, and a way of expanding in terms of conquest. Whereas in opposition to it had emerged what could be called parliamentary Britain, Whig Britain, the Hanoverian Britain, King George II and King George III. And that Britain wasn't simply a rival great power, but representative of an alternative system of government, an alternative relationship between political power or government and society, in which essentially there was a parliamentary system of government where the government, which of course flowed from the crown, like it did in France, nevertheless wasn't an independent authority, but rather was subject to parliament and the rule of law. And therefore, it was understood to be a legal or constitutional monarchy, a monarchy and executive government that ruled through parliament and, more broadly than that, the law. It had religious toleration. Although Great Britain had two official churches, the Church of England south of the border in England and the Presbyterian Kirk north of the border in Scotland, nevertheless, those churches were not allowed, unlike the Roman Catholic Church in France, to repress or persecute the population. They were official churches, the Church of England in England and the Presbyterian Kirk in Scotland, in Great Britain, but they could not persecute religious dissenters, religious minorities in civil society. So this was a system of religious toleration that meant since these churches couldn't, like the Roman Catholic Church in France, persecute religious minorities, they basically withdrew from controlling civil society. And within British civil society, there flourished religious minorities, most immediately around the time of the Glorious Revolution, Protestant nonconformist Protestant dissenters, that is Protestant groups that did not conform to the official church, the Church of England. But over time, Catholics, and as well in large cities like Bristol, Liverpool, London, Jews, Muslims, etc. So it was religiously tolerant. And furthermore, it was understood to be a state that was broadly what we might call liberal. That is, where the French state was understood to be civil authoritarian, that is, emphasizing the authority of political power over the liberty of society and the individual. The British system was understood to be civilly libertarian, that is, favoring the liberties of society and the individual over political authority. And so this great war, as you described it, as Winston Churchill famously described it, the First World War, the 7 Years' War, which was fought across the Americas, what was known as the French and Indian War, was fought in the seas and countries of Asia. And of course, its primarily the site of conflict was in Europe itself. This was understood to be a great war between absolute monarchy on one hand and this kind of Whig Britain, which was understood to be at the center of an empire of liberty on the other hand.
So could the religious toleration is obviously an aspect of a broader revolution in society, in and of society, a society of free labor. Could you tell us how, in what sense can we speak of the British Empire issuing from 1648 as an empire of liberty?
Sure. Happy to define that. So the Empire of Liberty, which is an idea that first develops within broadly the British world, by which I mean not simply Britain or the British Isles, but also the kind of wider British Atlantic world, including its colonies overseas in the Americas. This idea of Empire of Liberty would have been understood historically as a contradiction in terms, meaning empire, imperium, dominium, power, was understood to be the antithesis of liberty. That is, if you had too much power, if imperium, dominion, empire was too great, it would destroy liberty. And liberty was understood to be the freedom of society and the freedom of the individual, right? And if that was too great, that might lead to a kind of anarchy, right? But there was a basic view that liberty and empire were contradictory principles. That is to say, dominion, imperium, empire, power was the antithesis of liberty. It would always snuff out liberty, particularly if it became too extensive. And liberty itself would snuff out dominion, imperium, power. If it became too extensive, you'd have a kind of anarchy. And what people began to think, not just within the British world, but within the wider Enlightenment world, the world of the Republic of Letters, the world of the public sphere of public opinion, that kind of transatlantic world that formed in the 17th and 18th centuries, across that transatlantic civil society, across that transatlantic public sphere of public opinion, there came a view that Britain had formed an empire of liberty, something new that wasn't contradictory. Why wasn't it contradictory? It wasn't contradictory because somehow Britain had made it so that greater liberty did not lead to anarchy, but led to an increase in power, an increase in imperial power, weight, capacities. And on the other hand, empire and dominion could develop, but instead of destroying liberty, it enhanced liberty. So there was this belief that following the 17th century upheavals in England, that is the English Revolution of the mid-17th century, which consisted of the English Civil Wars and the English Interregnum, the time between kings, the time of the Commonwealth or Republic and the Protectorate of Oliver Cromwell. Between that period of the English Revolution, the mid-17th century, and the Glorious Revolution, it was understood that this age of upheavals in England in the 17th century, again, the period from the English Revolution to the Glorious Revolution, had created this very unique empire of liberty, where empire, imperium, dominion, power did not destroy liberty, but rather enhanced, expanded, enriched liberty. And likewise, liberty did not destroy power dominion by leading to anarchy, but rather grew power and dominion. So I realize, Clint, I've just delayed answering your question by introducing new terms, but that's the terms in which the later 17th and 18th century Enlightenment world, Enlightenment transatlantic world, adjudicates this new political phenomenon that's developed in the British world, this empire of liberty. Mm-hmm. So how then did this empire of liberty come into being? Well, effectively, what happened, Clint, is exactly to what you pointed to, the English Revolution in the mid-17th century, right? That those upheavals of the civil wars and the interregnum, later, finally, although initially undone by the restoration of the Stuart monarchy in 1660, then the Stuart monarchy itself was transformed in the Glorious Revolution of 1689. And what those political developments between the 1640s and the 1680s had done is subjected the state to the society over which it ruled. That is to say that the state that had developed in England, above all, obviously the monarchy and the government that flowed from it, had become not the master of the society or the civil society over which it ruled, but rather had become the servant of that civil society over which it ruled. Now, that would involve a very long story if I could maybe go into some further details about things. Would that be okay?
Sure.
So basically, just for the sake of time, during the 15th and 16th century, across Western Europe, basically Europe west of the Elbe River, you have a total transformation of society. You've had the crisis of the Middle Ages, you've had the collapse of feudalism, you've had the rise of free labor, you've had the Age of Discovery, which leads to the Portuguese creation of a direct maritime route between Europe and Asia, Columbus's discovery of the New World, the Americas eventually by further European explorers. You have the Reformation, the breakup of Western Christendom. You have, of course, during all of these events, the Age of Discovery, the Reformation, the Renaissance is going on, the kind of rediscovery of a pre-Christian secular civilization of the ancient world. All of that is happening and leading to a new society that is the end of medieval feudal society and the rise of modern commercial society. That is, so to speak, the revolution of society, right? That is society in its granular, molecular, whatever you want to call it, subatomic, local developments is slowly changing. All of the actors, the events remain the same, but the way people are relating to each other, the way people interact with one another is profoundly changing on a molecular, granular level in society. And this leads eventually to massive political transformations. And for purposes of time, what this leads to is the development of the so-called new monarchies, or the Renaissance monarchies of the 16th and early 17th century, and they become the absolute monarchies, meaning this transformation in social relations that's going on a granular, molecular level in everyday life leads to basically the undermining of feudalism, the old feudal nobility and their band of retainers, the old way of doing things, that eventually leads to the rise of the centralized territorial state. And in control of that is the old medieval monarchies. But the old medieval monarchies did not used to have, the old medieval monarchies used to not have any actual state apparatus at their control. Meaning the old medieval monarchies depended on the feudal barons, right? If you were a medieval monarch, you didn't have a permanent administration. You didn't have clerks and a bureaucracy. You didn't have a standing army, right? So you needed the medieval barons and their retainers to basically form a kind of collective power. But now, with the development of the revolution of society, this is giving rise to permanent administrations, permanent bureaucracies. This is giving rise to standing armies. And this is allowing previously weak medieval monarchs to become strong, powerful monarchs because they have a centralized territorial state at their beck and call, right? And this is really the basis of absolute monarchy, that medieval monarchs, who was always understood to be God's anointed, who are practically quite weak, are becoming practically very strong with bureaucracies and administrations. And what effectively happens, Clint, is these monarchies find it in their interests to support the development of what we could call commercial social relations or bourgeois social relations. They support the development of bourgeois society, of commercial society. They eliminate different systems of weight and measurements. They homogenize weights and measurements. They homogenize coinage. They eliminate internal tariffs and barriers. They create homogeneous economic spaces. They attack and weaken the feudal nobility. They turn the nobility into courtiers, people who are not, great barons commanding their own small armies, but rather simply courtiers or office holders. They do all of these things that are basically designed to homogenize and centralize and consolidate society. They further bourgeois and commercial society, right? But effectively, in a series of areas like in the Spanish Netherlands, where there's Habsburg monarchy is pursuing this project of absolute monarchy, or like in England, where the Stuart monarchy is pursuing absolute monarchy, they, to some degree, what happens is, even though they've created, these monarchies supported the development of bourgeois or commercial society, they ultimately did it for their own purpose, meaning they understood society to be their servant. Society was developing for their power political interests, for their dynastic interests, for their ability to develop and maintain their own power political interests overseas and at home. They understood society to be their subject. What happens in the great bourgeois revolutions, initially in the Dutch Revolt, the later 16th and early 17th century, but above all in the English Revolution, stretching from the 1640s to the Glorious Revolution of 1688, in those bourgeois revolutions, what happens is society, right, no longer accepts that it is the subject of the government, of the monarch, but rather rises up in these bourgeois revolutions and subjects the government, the monarch, to become subjects it to itself. So whereas the Habsburg monarchs in the Spanish Netherlands or the Stuart monarchs in England had thought of the bourgeois society, commercial society that they were furthering as their servants, society as their servants. Rather, what happens in the bourgeois revolutions is the government becomes the servant of society, right? Because even though these absolute monarchies had found it in their interest to attack local feudal powers, to homogenize and integrate their realms, to further commercial and bourgeois society, they nevertheless maintained themselves as an absolute power or an arbitrary power outside of those societies. They understood their authority to be beyond those societies.
Right.
What happens in the classical bourgeois revolutions, in the Dutch revolts and the English Revolution, is rather society subjects that external power to its own reproduction, to its own development. And those arbitrary powers become legal powers. That is, powers who do not serve the particular interests of the monarch, but rather serve the general interests of society. To make a long story very, very short, the English Revolution from the 1640s to the 1680s, culminating in the Glorious Revolution, subjects government, and government flows from the crown. It's a royal government. That's why it's called, the ministers are called the cabinet. It comes from the royal cabinet, literally the royal household. That royal government is being forced to be made the servant of the whole of society by being subjected to having to rule with parliament and having to rule through law. The absolute monarchy of the Stuarts becomes the constitutional monarchy, the lawful monarchy, the parliamentary monarchy of Great Britain, and it becomes the servant of society. And that's what allows for the empire of liberty, Clint, because effectively what happens is Parliament, right, is a vehicle, even though it's largely a landed elite assembly, right? Parliament is representative of a wider swath of society. It comes from all over, but after 1707, it comes from all over Great Britain, right? It represents all of these diverse constituencies and areas of Great Britain. And essentially, it becomes a channel for society communing information, right, to basically the government. How does that actually work in workaday governmental life? Well, what's understood is Parliament is under all law, ultimately has to be written and codified in Parliament, in the legislature. And ultimately, the king becomes the executor the government becomes the executor, upholder of that law. So the monarchy, royal government, is no longer a law unto itself. Rather, via the mechanism of Parliament and its constituencies throughout Great Britain, the sense of the people, the sense of society is communicated to Parliament. Parliament forms laws, and then the royal government basically upholds and enforces those laws. And this creates an empire of liberty, because effectively what happens, Clint, is what's discovered is that if basically you raise a tax not arbitrarily, the Stuart kings tried to raise things like ship money, arbitrary tax, where they simply tried to go to society and say, your wealth is really my wealth, the king's wealth. And so I can arbitrarily take wealth from you as I need it. But that's seen as an attack on the private property of everybody, right? On all the private property in the Lockean sense, the property created and constituted by one's labor and freely and voluntarily exchanged with others. That's seen as assault on people and their private property. But because of this parliamentary constitutional legal monarchy that comes to existence, because basically broadly Britain can communicate to its parliament, right? The sense of the people, the sense of society, and Parliament forms the law, and Parliament decides to raise taxes, and then the king, the government, is simply the instrument, the executive for raising those taxes. Those taxes are understood to be passed by society on itself. So those taxes are understood to be legitimate. So not to get to the boring nitty-gritty of the history of 18th century Britain, but there was a great study done by a historian named John Brewer called The Sinews of Power, where he compared the actual tax collection in Great Britain to Habsburg Austria, to Hohenzollern Prussia, to Bourbon France. And even though the kings, the emperor in Austria, the king of Prussia, the king of Great Britain, can actually have a much higher tax base, they collect very little of it, because it's not seen as legitimate. So people resist paying it. It's an arbitrary tax. And because they resist paying it, they have to send the army out to collect it, and it costs them even more revenue. But in Great Britain, basically, people pay about 80, even though it's a very light tax, they're lightly taxed. Actually, there's much more taxes that the state takes in Great Britain, because people actually view it as legitimate, because the taxes are debated in Parliament. And Parliament is understood to be the vehicle for the sense of the people, the sense of society, to be brought to government. And so Parliament is passing those taxes and allowing government to actually collect and raise them, right? So it's understood as society passing taxes on itself, society raising revenue on itself. So that's viewed as legitimate. So as a result, about 80 to 90, even though the taxes are lighter in Britain, 80 to 90% of them that are collected. So we have this very weird paradox that's solved if we think of the Empire of Liberty, which is even though taxes are on paper less in Great Britain than elsewhere, in reality, they're heavier, not because they're heavier imposition on the people, because they're actually collected, whereas they're not actually collected in France, Prussia, and Austria to anywhere near the extent they are in Britain. So because the people believe that the government is the vehicle of the liberty of society and the liberty of individual, they are willing to freely support the government. And that gives the government more power, more empire, more dominion, more imperial, which means its power expands. It doesn't go to anarchy, but rather because it protects the liberty of society and individual, its power expands. And it can actually not simply fight France like it did in the late 17th century to a tie, but it can essentially defeat France all over the world. That is, Little Britain, just 6 million people, defeats a France of 25 million people, right? Little Britain, that doesn't really have a lot of natural resources, can actually defeat a France that's got much more agriculture, that's the great economic life of the pre-modern world, and very less natural resources all over the world. Little Britain can raise a gigantic navy and can send troops all over the world. They can supply material and supply chains and send manpower and money across the world, because ultimately it's viewed as legitimate. So liberty expands, but it expands imperium, empire. Likewise, Clint, because empire doesn't expand arbitrarily. The government isn't arbitrarily saying we're going to do this and do that. Rather, if the government wants money, it's got to go to parliament and say, we'd like you to raise more taxes, raise more revenue on the people. And parliament says, oh, really? What would you like it for? And the government has to explain to parliament what it wants. And there's a negotiation. And eventually the government can only get the revenue and taxes that the people, that society, that its representative body, parliament, thinks will further the interests of society as a whole. So the government isn't just arbitrarily raising money to fight wars on a whim. It's arbitrarily raising, it's non-arbitrarily raising money to fight these great wars against France, which are understood as wars to protect British colonies, to protect British markets, to protect British sea lanes, to allow Britain to continue import and export goods from all over the world, to allow Britain to continually settle in the colonies, to export its manufacturing, all of that. So the point here, Clint, is the system of empire liberty is under the British world is understood to have somehow overcome the great contradiction. It's understood to make empire serve liberty and liberty serve empire. And this is done because it's understood that the British state has become the servant and not the master of civil society. It is the subject. It does not subject society. It is the subject of society.
Yeah, very good. So the way that the bourgeois revolution is typically taken is as a revolution of and for the bourgeoisie. Can you say a bit about how this revolution in society is much more broadly of the third estate, of free labor, of peasants escaping to cities, and the dynamism of selling your labor?
Absolutely. Listen, I'm now 2 decades into having this argument with people about what did classical Marxism mean by the bourgeois revolution. And all of the various interlocutors I've had over the years can always find passages in the writings of classical Marxists, right? By which I mean roughly from the writings of Marx and Engels themselves through to the early Second International. They can always find passages that say things like the bourgeois revolution is when the bourgeoisie, rooted in a different form of economy, overthrows the feudal aristocracy rooted in a different form of economy. They can always find a letter of a classical Marxist that appears to support their ultimately class determinist view, right? Which is that essentially the bourgeois revolution is a class conflict, right? In which a bourgeoisie rooted in a developing bourgeois society overthrows a feudal aristocracy rooted in a feudal society. I mean, the problem with that is it violates the whole spirit of classical Marxism. So what I'm about to say, I want to introduce the conundrum, which is that what I'm about to start the conundrum, the problem that there will always be somebody who will go out and find some quote in the body of classical Marxism that says the bourgeois revolution is just the bourgeoisie in the sense of the owners of the means of production, right? The proto-industrialists or the merchants, the bankers, what have you, overthrowing the feudal aristocracy. But in the whole spirit of classical Marxism, what's clear is, and Marx says this in a number of times, he says the bourgeois revolution is the great uprising of the new society, right? It's the new society. Now, what is meant by all of that? It goes back to what I was saying happened in the 15th and 16th century. That is to say, serfdom collapsed in Europe west of the Elbe River in Western Europe, basically from the Italian Iberian peninsulas in the south all the way up through Scandinavia. Serfdom collapsed. You had free labor. Now, initially, this doesn't change things. People are still impoverished peasants living on the countryside, right? But over time, okay, people are not immediately subject to a feudal lord. Rather, they can determine how to set the course of their own existence, maintain their own plot of land. They can determine how they want to work and spend their daily life and activity. Do they want to work harder and make a surplus so they can have more that they can go and trade in the village square for other things and then to get new tools and reinvest and all of that kind of stuff, right? And this kind of free labor allows for slow commercialization of society. Then, of course, you get the discovery of the New World. You get few years before that, the creation of the direct maritime passage between Europe and Asia, and this vastly increases, right, commercial society in Europe, right? It vastly increases commercialization. So effectively, from the breakdown of feudalism in the later Middle Ages through the kind of Renaissance and Age of Discovery and Reformation stretching to the 16th century, we see a great transformation of social relations in Europe, of social life in Western Europe, where essentially the direct producers, the everyday laborers, whether they're peasant farmers in the countryside, artisan craftsmen, would have you in the towns and cities, become free laborers. Okay? Now, a great expression for capturing this is Stadtluft macht frei. That is a term from the Holy Roman Empire, a German expression from the Middle Ages, meaning town air makes a man free, or town air makes one free. Okay? And that was the great cry of the peasant escaping serfdom, escaping the feudal lord and going into the urban commune, the town, where the feudal lord's privileges and rights couldn't access. And so the peasant was understood to be more free in the town, right? Although ultimately the peasant would have to become a laborer and ultimately enter within the guild system and all of the strictures and restrictions of the guild system that said you had to produce a service or a good, whether it was making a violin or making a sword, if you were, you know, a weapons maker or a blacksmith or a goldsmith or a carpenter or producing fine textiles or jewelry. Ultimately, you had a very narrow group of people buying from you, your patrons, your aristocratic patrons, and you were producing in a very guild-determined sort of way, right? But what we can say is, with the crisis of the later Middle Ages, with the breakdown of serfdom and unfree labor and the rise of free labor, and then continuing through the Renaissance and the development, the efflorescence of towns and cities, right? So if I put all the chains together, it basically goes this way. In the later Middle Ages, 13th, 14th, 15th century, serfdom is breaking down. Free labor is developing west of the Elbe, right? But people are still mostly peasant farmers in the countryside. But you begin to see, right, greater commerce and mobility enter into the countryside. And you begin to see people move away from the towns and cities, move away from the countryside into the towns and cities. And that's the great basis of the Renaissance, right? That's the great basis of the Renaissance. And the Renaissance is sometimes understood as purely Italian, and that's a profound mistake. The Renaissance is a function of the newly flourishing, the efflorescent towns and cities of Western Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries. Now, the greatest urban zones of Western Europe, the greatest conurbation areas of Western Europe, by which I mean areas of 5,000 people or more living on top of one another, is central and northern Italy, the northern half of the Italian peninsula, from Rome to Genoa, Venice, Milan, Florence, more in the north, but also in the Netherlands, in the Low Countries, right? In today's Belgium, Luxembourg, and Netherlands, Benelux, you get Ghent and Antwerp and Bruges and Rotterdam and The Hague and Amsterdam and all of these kinds of towns and cities flourishing. London is a great Renaissance capital, right? So basically, as you have the end of serfdom and the rise of free labor in the later Middle Ages, the 13th, 14th, 15th century, you slowly have the commercialization and transformation of the countryside, and then people begin moving into towns and cities, and you get the Renaissance, because it's really in towns and cities that people experience the collective force of their free life together. It's in those towns and cities of the Renaissance, like London in England, like Antwerp and Amsterdam and Bruges in the Low Countries, like Milan and Florence and Genoa in the central and northern Italy. It's there where people begin, because you have people moving in from the countryside, right? And now what's beginning to happen, Clint, is merchants and manufacturers who want to circumvent the guild system, right, can actually, initially they're going out to the countryside, because these merchants and manufacturers in the Low Countries, in England, in Italy, in France, because they're aware of the fact that there's now basically free labor in the countryside. They're aware of the fact that people are no longer dominated by feudal lords. You initially have putting out. meaning merchants and manufacturers will send cloth that they want to be, they'll send raw materials that they want to be spun and weaved out into the countryside. And so the now free peasant, right, the still impoverished rural peasant, who now is a free laborer, Clint, basically, he's no longer an unfree laborer. She's no longer an unfree laborer. They're no longer a serf. They no longer have to listen to a feudal lord that directs their lives. Rather, they can decide, well, I know that I need this much to subsist, and I know that I have to pay this much tax to the king. But if I work harder, or I reorganize the way I work smarter, I can actually, right, either make more of a surplus or give myself time to work for the putting out merchant or manufacturer, right? That is, my wife or me, myself, I can spin and weave clothes. I can take these raw materials and work them up, right? And I can take this extra money coming from the merchant manufacturer who wants to escape the guild system of the town. And while that develops the whole putting out system in now free commercial agriculture, eventually laborers begin to move into, free laborers begin to move into the towns and cities, and merchants and manufacturers do not have to have a putting out system. They can set up workshops, manufactories totally free from the guild system, employing wage laborers. But those Renaissance towns and cities are so important, Clint, because it's there where people begin to realize something they still can't realize in the free or commercial countryside, which is the power of associational free collective life between people. People living on top of one another, people interacting, having a dense network of free voluntary relations in their everyday life where they can form reading clubs, they can form civil associations, they can form whole civic groups that do things like try and spread new hygiene and cleanliness across the city. They can try and organize whole new aspects of urban life. It's really there where the potentialities of bourgeois society, the potentiality of the free relations of everyday life, civil society, come really onto line. And the Renaissance is the real realization, if you will, of this new power of a collective free life that is not reducible to either the individual or the coercive power of the state. That something has come online that is much greater than the sum of its parts, which is this kind of free relations of everyday life, of civil society. And just to finish from there, I apologize, to go on, this is the revolution of society. It's really from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment, from roughly the later 15th and early 16th century to the 18th century. It's that trajectory, that intellectual trajectory in Europe, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment. Forget all of this stuff about, oh, it's something Western, inherent in Western civilization. Nonsense. It's because bourgeois social relations have most thoroughly developed in Western Europe, right? That reflection upon, systematic thinking about, systematic criticism of, systematic public discussion of bourgeois social relations is going on. And that is the entire intellectual trajectory from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment. It's the open air discussion of the transformation in everyday life that's going on in Western Europe. And we see, Clint, by the 17th century, every major Western European language either invents the term society, what we mean by it, or they transform a term they already had, society. You can look across Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, French, German, English, etc. Those languages either had a term society by which they meant kind of like a society, a group of people gathered together, a society for doing something, right? But they begin to develop this more abstract sense of society. You see a new, either a whole new word for society created, or you see the transformation, like in English, of a pre-existing word of society, where society develops this abstract character, that there's an assemblage, a totality of social relationships, that all of these free relations in daily life of free individuals creates a sum that's much greater, right? That leads to a sum that's much greater than its parts. That there's something going on in the totality that's much greater than the sum of its parts, which they give the name society. And the whole intellectual trajectory from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment is Western Europe in the reading public, in the public sphere, becoming self-conscious of the fact that this revolution of society has taken place, and that the real dynamism of Western Europe, the real site of its freedom, of its prosperity, of its culture, of its education, of its science, is not government, is not political authority, is not political power, even democratic political power. This isn't democracy, right? It's rather civil liberty, civil freedom. It's the freedom of society as a collectivity and of the individuals who compose it as individuals that is really the site of all of this new prosperity, culture, science, knowledge developing in Western Europe.
Right. So society is beginning to subordinate the state to itself through the British Empire, through the revolution, the Cromwellian Empire, so to speak.
Or let's say the empire that, like, we're truncated a lot, but basically we could say that there's a process of English revolutionary upheaval between the civil wars between Crown and Parliament in the 1640s through to the Glorious Revolution of 1688 that transforms the English monarchy to become essentially a state that rules through society instead of above it.
Right. And so once that revolution has full scope to expand internally and externally after the 7 Years' War, what kind of reaction and crisis of that success is triggered off? So how should we begin to think about both the conservative new Toryism and the radical Whig response with respect to what it would mean to carry the success of that revolution forward?
That's a great question. So at the beginning of the 7 Years' War, I'm talking here mid to late 1750s, France and its allies are winning. That is, until about 1758, France is effectively winning that war. And it's seen that Bourbon despotism, by which I mean the combination of absolute monarchy, religious intolerance, religious persecution, and civil authoritarianism, political authority over civil liberty, that combination is seen to be on the march around the world. However, basically, Britain, beginning in roughly 1757, 1758, begins a turnaround. We need not get into the details of it. And ultimately, by 1759, 1760, Britain has run the tables against France. Not only has it won its defensive aims, which is to peel back the French victories that have been won in 1754, 1755, 1756, it actually goes beyond its wildest dreams and has a rout against France. It totally defeats France. So by 1760, whereas the aim of British arms in the 7 Years' War had effectively to prevent the expansion of New France in the Americas, the overwhelming of colonial British North America by New France, Quebec. Rather, what happens is there's total victory. British arms don't simply successfully defend colonial British North America, they completely take New France. Quebec as a whole falls to British arms. And suddenly there's no longer any serious French presence in the Americas. Likewise, the goal of the British Crown, the British Royal Navy, and the British East India Company in Asian territories and waters had simply to beat back the threat posed to them by the French Crown, the French East India Company, and their South Asian allies, but rather they run the table. They completely defeat French forces in Asia. Likewise, there's incredible victories of Britain's main allies, the alliance being run by Ferdinand of Brunswick, and then Prussia, Frederick the Great, really thoroughly has some successful victories. So effectively, Clint, by the end of the 7 Years' War, Britain has not simply undone France's early victories, it has run the table in every major theater of not only Europe, but overseas activity, the Caribbean, the Americas, the Asian waters and territories. And so there's a hope that the Empire of Liberty will expand throughout the world, that this British Empire of Liberty, which was limited to the British world, that is the British Isles and its colonial settlements in the Atlantic, will actually expand much farther than the eye can see. I mean, I don't have this immediately to hand, but in 1760, Benjamin Franklin writes a letter to his friend, the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, Lord Keynes. And he says to Lord Keynes, oh, this is the greatest victory ever, the greatest political structure that human wisdom has ever created. That is, this British Empire of Liberty now has no more obstacles, and it can expand across the world, right? That basically British arms can now become the vehicle, not for the oppression or exploitation of peoples, but rather for the self-expansion of this empire of liberty, right, across the world. That's the great hope of the early 1760s. And that informs what you call radical Whiggery, right? That's the great hope of radical Whiggery, that what is developed here within the British world, above all in Britain itself, can become the basis of a wider British empire of liberty, right? That's the hope. And crucially, Clint, that won't just mean the Atlantic world, the colonies of settlement in the Americas and the West Indies, the Caribbean, but there's a hope here, and this is something that me and my colleague Spencer Leonard, I think, have really argued and to my mind, demonstrated. There's a real capacity that it might even expand in Asia, that this empire of liberty, this civil society, could potentially, expand in Asia, that the success of British arms in Asia could become a bridgehead, not for a monopolistic, autocratic East India Company and a liberal imperium that the British eventually set up, but could become a bridgehead rather for a kind of connection between mercantile or commercial manufacturing society in Britain in India. Now, that would entail thinking of the conquered areas of India, that is, the British East India Company controlled areas of India, above all Bengal, as part of this wider British Empire of Liberty. It wouldn't be about Bengal having to replay all of British history. That's insane. It would rather be about Bengal basically being integrated and being considered a fully fledged member of this British Empire of Liberty, right? Within a kind of division of labor and commercial exchange, protected and cultivated within this British Empire of Liberty. And if that perspective was taken, and there were many in Britain arguing for it at the time, the belief was, well, we shouldn't monopolize Bengali commerce to ourselves. Rather, we should open up the trade, because the more trade that Bengali merchants and manufacturers can do, ultimately the more tax revenue we'll raise and the more power we'll have to protect through the Royal Navy the sea lanes of the world, the markets of the world. And eventually Bengali merchants and manufacturers will participate in this wider seaborne empire of liberty. They'll be trading, throughout Asian waters, and eventually themselves, going beyond the Cape of Good Hope, trading to Britain, to Europe, to the Americas, all within this empire of liberty, this kind of a cloak of protection of the Royal Navy and the wider British Empire.
And so, but that doesn't appear to be the course that is taken by the sort of conservative turn with the new Toryism. And we can see this both in the colonies and with respect to the East India Company. So can you explain how it's part of this one imperial crisis of success that you're getting, so to speak, a civil war within the bourgeois revolution, right? Within the British Empire of Liberty, right? How you're now having a civil war, or how we move to that civil war, which we can call the American Revolution.
Sure. Yeah, and that's precisely, you've hit the nail on the head. That's how one needs to think about the American Revolution in its beginning. A civil war within the British Imperium, this British Empire of Liberty. It's important to remember that the American Revolution is the pressing of the button that says escape on the kind of, if you will, like the control pad, right? The American Revolution is a dire, desperate pressing of an escape button, okay? Because originally, what colonial Americanists and historians of the American Revolution understand the beginning of the American Revolution is not the beginning of the American Revolution. Really, what the early phase of what's happening is a contest over the control of the British Empire. That is ultimately what's at stake in the 1760s, in the wake of the 7 Years' War. It is a contest over the control of the British Empire. That is, there are those, some people might call them radical patriots, some people might call them radical Whigs, but there are those radical Whig or radical patriot forces who basically believe that this is a unique moment to expand and fully consolidate a British empire of liberty. And what they understand by that is essentially you will have a reform of the British Parliament so that it becomes more representative of the kind of British society that is developed, right? The British Parliament formed in the Middle Ages as a council to the king. It formed in an entirely different feudal agricultural society. Britain, by the mid to late 18th century, is a far more commercial, urban society on the eve of the world's first thoroughgoing industrialization. There's an idea, therefore, that the parliament is no longer adequately representative of society, right? That it has to be a better transmission belt for the sense of the people, for the sense of society to government. So parliament has to be reformed, not in some way that it has to be mass democracy. That's not what they're arguing. Rather, it has to become more representative, right? By making these new towns that have emerged and these cities that have grown, give them more MPs, by including new forms and species of property, commercial, manufacturing, financial, banking, not simply agrarian property, in the parliamentary system. That will allow parliament to become a better communication conveyor, a better transmission belt of the sense of the people, of the sense of society to the government, to the crown. So these radical Whigs or radical patriots are in favor of a reform of parliament. A very few of them at the very radical fringe talk about universal manhood suffrage, but mostly what they're arguing for is that representation be expanded to the new manufacturing towns and commercial ports that have arisen that don't have representation, and to the cities that are really ballooned, above all London, but also Bristol, Liverpool, under this era of commercialization, urbanization. And furthermore, that the qualification, the property qualification, not simply be real estate, landed property, but actually be open to any species of property constituted by labor and exchange, entrepreneurship, work, enterprise, which can be financial property, securities, which can be manufacturing property, manufacturing industrial wealth, which can be commercial wealth, etc. That rather property, in their view, is not fixed, but is mobile. And that should be the measure. Their other view, of course, is that if you think of property as mobile and not fixed, that means that any number of people can enter into property ownership, if that makes sense, right? Meaning that there's no bar to property ownership, okay? So if you read the radical Whigs and patriots, and by this I don't merely mean British thinkers, but I mean even European thinkers, Immanuel Kant is a radical patriot, right? And he believes in a property qualification to vote, but by property qualification, he means mobile property, not fixed property. And the whole point of the property qualification, when you transform it to fixed to mobile, is that anyone can accumulate in Britain or anywhere in Europe where land is already settled and monopolized. If you think of it as mobile property, anybody can accumulate enough property to eventually have a stake in society and therefore have a vote in the system, if that makes sense. Right. So right. The radical Whigs or radical patriots want a liberalization, democratization of the British state at home, principally through the reform of parliament, the breakup of existing monopolies, the undermining of statutes and regulations that still restrict and control commercial life and free exchange and all of that. Likewise, those radical Whigs and patriots want a more participatory imperial system. They want one of two things. They either want colonial assemblies that have developed in the Atlantic colonies, that have developed in North America and the West Indies, to have a say in decisions that affect the life of the empire as a whole by working with the parliament in London, or they want to reform the parliament in London and include representatives from the Atlantic colonies. So essentially the radical Whigs and patriots don't simply want to liberalize and democratize the British political order at home through the reform of parliament to make it more representative of commercial society or bourgeois society. They want to basically reform the system of imperial decision making by either making the Parliament in London coordinate, negotiate, work with the colonial assemblies in a confederation, as Benjamin Franklin famously opposed, as Benjamin Franklin famously proposed as the Albany Plan at the Albany Conference in 1754, a confederation where the Parliament in London would coordinate with the colonial assemblies, or they want the colonies to elect representatives that will go to sit in the Parliament in London, just like Scotland did after the Union of Scotland and England in 1707. So you would have representatives from Jamaica and South Carolina and Virginia and New York and Massachusetts sitting alongside the representatives of Scotland and of Newcastle and of Norwich and of Liverpool and of Bristol and of London in that parliament. So these radical Whigs, radical patriots wanted the liberalization and democratization of not simply the British domestic order, but the wider imperial order, to make it, not to make it mass democracy in our sense, but rather to make the political order more adequate to commercial society or bourgeois society as it had developed since the 16th century. They wanted the domestic political order in Britain and the imperial political order throughout the British Empire to be to better receive the sense of the people, the sense of society. And that's why the radical Whigs and radical patriots really begin to think through this category of representation, meaning the most sophisticated thinking we've ever had in world history about this category of political representation stems from the imperial crisis and eventually the American Revolution. There had been thinking on representation before this, but it's no accident that it's in this crisis of the 1760s, this imperial crisis, where political representation is thought about more profoundly and deeply than ever before. Why? Because these people don't want a revolution. They don't want a bloody revolution, Clint. There was a bloody revolution in England. It led to Cromwell, it led to a military dictatorship, right? Often bloody revolutions can lead to much worse outcomes than better outcomes. What they want is to somehow make the government more responsive to the people and society as they developed over the preceding centuries, more responsive to commercials, what they call commercial society, what we might call bourgeois society. Right, again, not the society of the bourgeoisie, but the society of bourgeois labor, of free labor, the society of free people. They want to make the domestic political order and the imperial order more responsive to society, to civil society, as it's developed in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, by making it better reflective, by making a better conveyor belt, if you will, from the sense of the people, the sense of society to government. And in their mind, that means reforming the representative systems that exist within Britain domestically, the Parliament in London, the Westminster Parliament, and within the British system imperially, thinking about how to rearrange the relationship between the Parliament in London and the assemblies in the colonies, either by putting them together in an imperial confederation or by bringing representatives directly from the colonies to sit in London. And it's really in the 60s, Clint, where the greatest political thinking ever about what political representation takes place. But it doesn't take place as America against Britain. It takes place as really a transatlantic debate throughout Western Europe and its Atlantic offshoots overseas in North and South America that reaches its greatest pitch in the area where bourgeois society or commercial society has developed the greatest, which is the British Atlantic world. And it's really in the British imperial crisis. The British imperial crisis is really, it starts off as a debate, not between Americans in the colonies and Britons in the British Isles, but rather a debate throughout the transatlantic Western world, in particular in the transatlantic British world, between radicals who believe that there slumbers within commercial society, right, the new untapped potentials and possibilities that can be better realized by rethinking political representation. And conservatives, right, who are, we could call authoritarians, who I'm happy to call the new Tories, although they're all impeccably Whig and pedigree. I call them the new Tories because I think they're anticipating a new position that only becomes emphatic during the French Revolution. But I call them the new Tories, and those people think that that's impossible. The view of the new Tories is that any expansion of liberty will not tap potentials and possibilities that go untapped, but will cause a collapse of society, right? So, Clint, what you have to realize, or not you yourself, but what I'm trying to communicate to the audience is this debate that takes place between new Tories and radical Whigs is not a replay of the 17th century debate between Tories and Whigs. Rather, it's a division within 18th century Whiggery, right? 18th century Whiggery fully embraced the idea of an empire of liberty, that the British domestic and imperial political system had done something unique, had overcome the previously seeming contradiction between imperium and liberty, but rather had figured out how to make empire work for liberty and liberty work for empire. What's happening in the 1760s is basically a debate across the British Empire. It's as strong in Jamaica as it is in London. It's as strong as Boston as it is in Bristol. And that debate is basically between radicals, who I like to call radical Whigs, or you could call radical patriots, who basically say that if we rethink the nature of political representation, if we make the state more responsive and accountable to society, if we make these assemblies, these legislatures somehow better conveyor belts for the sense of the people, the sense of society to government, to power, we actually will realize possibilities and potentialities of commercial bourgeois society we can only dream of. Those guys were previously 18th century Whigs, but they're becoming in the 1760s radical Whigs, radical patriots. Why? Because other 18th century Whigs are basically saying, no, the highest point of development we can have is our current political order, both at home in Britain and in the empire. Basically, what these more conservative 18th century Whigs say in the 1760s is, no, we cannot expand liberty. We cannot make political power government through changes in representation more adequate, more responsive to society, more adequate, more responsive to the sense of the people, to the sense of society, to commercial society. That will be a recipe for what these 18th century Whigs, becoming conservatives, becoming new Tories, call licentiousness. Licentiousness means when liberty gets so far out of bounds that it disrupts the empire of liberty. Liberty becomes anarchic and destroys power, if you follow my drift, right?
Yes,
so
yes.
This is a civil war within 18th century Whiggery. One half of 18th century Whiggery is saying we have reached the highest possible stage of development we can get, which is the system of parliamentary rule that exists in Britain and the imperial system as it presently exists throughout the British Empire, over which it must be understood ultimately a majority of decision of parliament is absolute. And this more conservative half of 18th century Whiggery basically asserts this. And against this view, there develops this more radical half of 18th century Whiggery that says, no, this system has only been a means to an end. We've only developed parliamentary government to allow for the state to be more responsive and more subordinated to society. And now we can make the state, through transforming representation, even more subordinate and responsive to society, and realize all these untapped potentials of commercial society, of the society of bourgeois labor, of free labor. And they're becoming radicals. And it's in this dialectic, this conflict between them, that essentially the positions become hardened. And you get a radical Whig, radical patriot position that understands itself as true Whigs, zealous Whigs, the true heirs of Whiggery, that say we need to reform Parliament in Britain to make it more representative of commercial and urban society here. And we need to reform the imperial system to make it more adequate to the imperial order that's developed. We need to include the colonial assemblies in decision-making, or we need to bring colonial representatives into the Parliament in London. And they are arrayed against the new Tories, who are now basically the conservative 18th century Whigs, who basically say this radicalism is an incredible threat. It's going to expand liberty too far. The Tories also, Clint, think they're defending society, because they think that if the radical Whigs create too representative a system, and remember, Clint, I'm a professional historian, and so what I always want to remind the audience of is to not be anachronistic and to not be presentist. I know we're all supposed to be leftists are supposed to be presentists. No, that's nonsense. The best leftism, the best Marxism rejects presentism entirely. We have to realize that we sit on the other side of these developments. So we know how they turned out. So of course we know that the radical Whigs were right in a broad sense. But we know that retrospectively at the time, there's every reason to think the conservative 18th century Whigs who are turning into the new Tories, that they might have been right. Their view was that you cannot make political authority as responsive and accountable, as representative of the society as the radical Whigs want. That's a bridge too far. If we make our political authority more representative, more responsive to society than we've already made it, that will create too much liberty, too much licentiousness. That will lead to the complete unfolding of civil society, of organized society, of society imbued by the rule of law, and lead to entire anarchy, which will lead to despotism. So we sit centuries after that debate. But there's every reason, right? We shouldn't be presentists. We should realize that that was a real debate within 18th century Whiggery. There was a real concern that the radical Whigs had a concern that if liberty did not continue to expand, if authority did not become more responsive and representative of society, then you would have too much authority and despotism that would destroy liberty. But the new Tories said, no, if you expand liberty too much, you will destroy authority and power, and you will have no civil society. You will have anarchy, and that will eventually lead to dictatorship, even worse than any despotism you fear. We sit on the other side of that. That was a real debate. And so people who were perfectly good 18th century Whigs, 18th century liberals could be on both sides of this debate, right? Could be on both sides initially. But over time, the conservative Whig come new Tory position hardens into a really illiberal position that basically says all political communities must have a final sovereign absolute authority somewhere. And in Great Britain, that is not a single person. It's not a king. It's not a Genevan patriciate. It's not a Venetian council. Rather, it's this much wider assembly parliament. But ultimately, that parliament is absolute. A majority decision in parliament can get rid of the city of London. And it literally can do that to this day, Clint, just so you know. Parliament can have a majority vote tomorrow and get rid of the city of London, right? It created a mayor of London under Tony Blair. It could get rid of mayor of London in tomorrow. It created an assembly in Wales, a parliament in Scotland, and could get rid of them tomorrow, right? So parliament is a final absolute authority. That's the conservative Whig come new Tory hardened position. And the radical Whigs really see that as becoming despotic. No, this is a recrudescence in their view of the idea that society serves the state, and it doesn't. The state serves society. Government needs to be the handmaiden of the self-development of civil society, of society. And so the radical Whig, radical patriot position is essentially that there must be a reform of representation within Britain and in the empire, and government must become more responsive to the sense of the people, the sense of society. And that really is what creates in colonial America what we now call the colonial American resistance movement, but simply understood itself, Clint, as the provincial wing of a much wider radical Whig, radical patriot movement within the greater British Atlantic world and indeed within the Western world as a whole.
Very good. So how does this initial escape hatch become a revolution?
Well, effectively, the conservative Whigs come new Tories who are hardening into this very illiberal position of parliamentary absolutism, which is articulated under the doctrine of virtual representation. These parliamentary absolutists basically come to consolidate their rule within Britain. Okay. Now, there are a number of reasons we could get into. I don't want to keep you on all night, but I'll simply say that effectively, there's a view in Britain that Britain is a free society. And if people take up arms against the government because the government is not reforming itself, their risk is they'll replay the English Civil Wars. They won't get basically a freer government. They'll get a greater anarchy, which will eventually lead to a despotism. right? Or worse yet, it will simply be civil war and bloodshed and all of that. So the essential view of many of the leading radical Whig and radical patriots within Britain is that they are unwilling to take up arms and to risk undoing the very free society they have in Britain. I mean, I want to make this clear, Clint. They have the freest society in the Western world, which means they have the freest society of the 18th century world, right? These people have to look at the possibility of taking up arms. So, to make a long story short, the conservative Whig come new Tories who articulating this position of parliamentary absolutism are against any reform of parliament to make it more representative. They're against any reform of the imperial order to make it more responsive to the way the empire has transformed. And as a result, these parliamentary absolutists, these civil authoritarians, these new Tories basically consolidate power and say there will be no liberalization or democratization of the British political order at home or abroad, domestically or imperially. So what radical Whigs and radical patriots are faced with in Britain is basically a dilemma. Do we take up arms, right? Because we can't get reform, do we go to revolution? And ultimately their decision is, most of them, few of them do threaten to take up arms, but most of them decide this is a free society. We have our basic civil liberties. We can continue to agitate for reform and transformation, and we will not take up arms to overthrow this regime because it could be a much worse outcome, right? Now, right. In colonial America, you have a more dire situation. Why do you have a more dire situation? You have a more just dire situation, Clint, because the reforms that the conservative Whigs and that the new Tories, these parliamentary absolutists, these political authoritarians are introducing in America, the imperial reforms that we know as the enforcement of the Trade and Navigation Acts that have not been enforced in decades, that we know as the creation of vice admiralty courts, where people in the colonies will not be tried by a jury of their peers, but rather will be tried by judges appointed by the crown in juryless trials. The Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Quartering Act, the Townsend duties, all of these things add up to something. Meaning if you put all of these conservative Whigs come new Tories, they're putting in place these imperial forms in the 1760s, like the enforcement of the Trade and Navigation Acts, like the Vice Admiralty courts that have trial by judges and not by juries, like the Sugar Act, like the Stamp Act, like the proclamation of 1763 preventing colonists from moving west of the Appalachian Mountains, like the Townsend Acts, the Townsend duties, like the Quartering Act. All of these go in one direction. And that direction is to centralize and militarize the empire. They also want to keep a peacetime standing army in the Americas of 10,000 redcoats. And they want to centralize and militarize the empire under the absolute rule of Parliament. Meaning, basically, they're not sending any troops to destroy the colonial assemblies. They're not sending any troops to set fire to the colonial assemblies or colonial presses or anything like that, right? Rather, what they're doing is they're creating an imperial military and imperial bureaucracy whose revenue will be dependent on taxes raised by Parliament in Britain. And those taxes raised by Parliament in Britain are basically going to be raised on the colonists, and then they're going to fund the imperial military and bureaucracy. Now, what does this system tend towards? Let me make it clear. All of these reforms and programs and policies tend to basically create an imperial bureaucracy and military that does not have to deal with the colonists through their representative institutions, but rather has to deal with Parliament. Why? Well, before these imperial forms, Clint, royal governors, royal bureaucrats, royal military officers they had no independent revenue source. They were sent out to London. If you were a royal bureaucrat, a royal military officer, a royal governor, you were sent out from London to the colonies, and you had to deal with their representative institutions, their colonial assemblies, to basically ask them to raise revenue. If you wanted better fortresses against Native Americans or French colonists, if you wanted to dredge a harbor to allow more ships to come in to increase trade, if you wanted to build turnpikes and roads, you had to go to the colonial assemblies and ask them to raise taxes on their society, right? And that opened up a whole process where both elected representatives and the provincial, the colonial press, colonial newspapers, pamphlets, the colonial constituents, electorates, even the people who didn't own enough property to qualify to vote, they all participated in debates and discussions about how the taxes and revenues raised on them should be spent. In other words, the colonial or the imperial bureaucracy and military, insofar as they existed, had to basically negotiate with colonial society to decide how to create a government that basically governed colonial society, which means that there could be no colonial government that was not extremely responsive and accountable to colonial society. And in fact, colonial government in colonial British North America as it existed before the 7 Years' War was even more responsive and accountable to society than Great Britain was. Why? Well, because in the 17th century, essentially, the model of basically voting was that you would get property qualifications in real estate. You would have land ownership, and that gave you a stake in society. And that's how basically parliamentary voting and representation functioned in Great Britain. That's the model taken into the colonial world. But of course, land is much more widely available there. People, after whether they're free immigrants from Europe or they're indentured servants, meaning they're unfree for a temporary period, eventually they acquire land. Land is widely and cheaply available. So effectively, whereas land is all monopolized and controlled and unavailable in Europe, people basically can acquire land in the New World. It's cheaply and widely available. So a much wider swath of the adult male population can become bourgeois property owners and can participate, right, in basically voting. So representation becomes much more actual in the colonies than anywhere else, not just in the British world, Clint, but in the entire Western world, and indeed the entire world. If you look at the 13 North American colonies from Georgia to New Hampshire on the eve of the 7 Years' War, you have never had a more representative political system in the history of the world. Across all 13 colonies, there is more participation in the writing and discussing and debating of newspapers and pamphlets and periodicals. There's more participation in the election and constituent system, in the representative systems. The colonial systems are much more representative of a wider swath. So the idea that the state is subordinate to society and that political authority should basically be responsive, accountable to the sense of the people, to the sense of society through their elected representatives is much, much stronger in colonial America, right? But nobody in colonial America on the eve of the 7 Years' War, Clint, thinks that this is peculiar to them. They think this is the nature of British liberty, right? So basically, what happens is in the 1760s, when the conservative Whigs come new Tories, assert this principle that an unreformed and unrepresentative legislature dominated by the British elite, the titled aristocracy of the House of Lords and the untitled nobility, the gentry in the House of Commons, that unrepresentative and unreformed parliament is the absolute master not only of society in Britain, but across the empire. That's an even greater threat to the colonies than it is to the British population. Because essentially what's going to happen, Clint, is this unreformed and unrepresentative parliament of the landed elite in Britain are going to raise taxes on the colonists, right? That's what the enforcement of the Trade Navigation Acts are about. That's what sending smugglers to the Vice Admiralty courts where there are no juries that have to basically agree to the fines, but the judges can impose fines and imprisonment is about. That's what the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act and the Quartering Act is all about. They're all about being able to allow the unreformed and unrepresented parliament in Great Britain to raise taxes and revenues on the colonists themselves and then use those taxes and revenues to fund the imperial state, the bureaucracy and the military in the colonies. And that means the bureaucracy and the military in the colonies no longer has to go hat in hand to the colonial assemblies, to colonial civil society, to the representatives of colonial civil society, and ask them for money. Rather, it will have an independent revenue base with which it basically can set its own policies. So the colonial assemblies, if you pardon me, Clint, will just become talk shops. They won't matter. They'll be insignificant. There will basically be an unreformed and unrepresented parliament in London that's the absolute master of the colonies because it can raise taxes on the colonists without having to consult a single colonial assembly or without having to include a single elected representative from the Atlantic colonies. It can then use that tax money to build a bureaucracy and a military. That bureaucracy and military is not going to view colonial society, the sense of the people in the colonies, as their master. Rather, they're going to view the unreformed and unrepresentative parliament in Great Britain, the landed elite in Great Britain, as their master. And that's why colonial America says it's not just that this system is inadequate. Like radical Whigs in America don't just say this system is inadequate, right? They say this system is a plan for slavery because they will actually lose that conveyor belt, that transmission system developed over 2 centuries by which the sense of the people, the sense of society in free speech, free association, free discussion and debate, gathering together in town meetings and county associations, publishing newspapers and periodicals, can basically have an influence on their elected representatives, and their elected representatives can then basically, right, agree to taxes and revenues passed on them. So effectively, they're getting the elimination of their entire colonial assemblies. They're getting the whole imperial forms don't just simply represent a so I'm maybe not articulating as well. Let me try and re-articulate this, Clint. In Britain, what radical Whigs and radical patriots face is a oligarchic parliament, a corrupt parliament, a parliament that's not adequately representative of British society. It's not adequately accountable or responsive to British society as it's developed as a commercial society, a bourgeois society. Right. In America, the threat's even greater because they're not simply facing the threat of corruption, of a parliamentary system, of a representative system that is not responsive. They're facing the threat of the elimination of a representative system altogether. Their conveyor belt, their transmission system for the sense of the people, for the sense of society, going through elected representatives and elected institutions to government is going to be eliminated altogether. And that's why they continuously call it in every newspaper, in every pamphlet from 1763 on. This is called the plan for slavery. When Jefferson says there's been in the Declaration of Independence, there's been a systematical plan for arbitrary power and to enslave the colonies, he's simply conveying what has become the consensus view of enlightened and informed public discussion and debate in the American colonies.
Right. So we're basically...
Just to finish your point, that's why it's a desperation. They're hitting the escape hatch because for them, the threat is greater. They've all sat there and watched, and I'm sorry for going on ad nauseum, but they've all sat there. They hope that their brothers, their sisters, their comrades, their colleagues, their fellow radical Whigs and radical patriots in Britain can bring the conservative Whig / new Tory parliamentary absolutist system to heel, that they can reform it, that they can liberalize and democratize the British political order at home and abroad. They're hoping that happens. They view their own colonial American resistance movement, their own Stamp Act Congress, their own Sons of Liberties as this just the provincial branches of this greater radical Whig movement. They're just supporting their British brothers and sisters. But by the consolidation of the conservative Whig / new Tory ministry of Lord North in 1770, they've come to believe that it's over, that there is not going to be any reform of the British political system at home or abroad, and that their radical Whigs, brothers and sisters, are not willing to take up arms in the cause. And so therefore, that is the colonial American resistance movement, increasingly thinks of themselves less and less as a pan-British radical Whig movement, a pan-imperial radical Whig movement, but a much more specific American patriot movement. And they've got to hit the escape hatch. By the way, that doesn't mean they're American nationalists. They believe they're defending the universal rights of civil society, but they believe to adequately defend the universal rights of civil society, they can no longer stay within the British imperial system. Therefore, they go to American patriotism, which they view as a more adequate route for the universal rights of civil society, and they hit the escape hatch in 1774 and 1775, and ultimately by declaring independence in 1776, which is they must take up arms and ultimately they must declare independence. And that's why a pan-imperial radical Whig movement ultimately becomes the American Revolution. The threat to them is much greater, and they conclude that this threat isn't going to be stopped in Britain itself.
Right. So how does this this attempt initially to just make government more responsive to a dynamic, expanding civil society where labor is creating property, generating the wealth of nations, where more people is a good thing. How does this enlightened civil society, as in a certain respect, the agent of history, become the basis of the new political order that is first, so to speak, declared in 1776 in the American Revolution, and then completed in the Constitution? Or more broadly, how is this not just a war for independence, but how is this an actual revolution of society? And then what is the relationship between that American Revolution and its, so to speak, codification in the Constitution 10 years later?
So that's a great question, because I think it's best, as you put it, to understand the American Revolution as a revolution for society. That is, we've had the way I like to put this is we've had the development of bourgeois social relations going back to the late Middle Ages. That's the revolution of society. And with the American Revolution and the wider age of revolution across the late 18th century Atlantic world is the revolution for society, right? To defend, to consolidate, and to expand the revolution of society that's already taken place. So the revolution of society is the development of bourgeois social relations across Western Europe and the wider Atlantic world from the late Middle Ages on. And then the revolution for society is basically society itself, civil society, organizing to defend, consolidate, and expand the revolution of society that's already taken place. Now, how does that play out in terms of the imperial crisis and the American Revolution? So basically, we can best think of the American revolutionary experience as a whole, by which I mean everything that happens in colonial British North America between the conclusion of the 7 Years' War in 1763 and the ratification of the federal constitution in 1788 as trying to actually create the empire of liberty on a more adequate basis. Okay, so let me just repeat that because I think it bears repeating. I think we can think of the American Revolution broadly conceived, the American revolutionary experience as a whole, from the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763 to the ratification of the federal constitution in 1788, as basically figuring out what was meant by this empire of liberty and trying to found it on a new and more adequate basis. And what we've discussed so far is the first phase, right? It's where these radical Whigs in the colonies are trying to defend the empire of liberty against what they view as this new Tory development, this attempt by centralizing and militarizing the empire under an absolute parliament to basically create too much empire, too much imperium, too much dominion, which they think will destroy liberty. Does that make sense? Is
Yes.
that clear? So basically, the radical Whig movement develops in Britain and the colonies because they think this conservative Whig, this new Tory, this parliamentary absolutist position is threatening to create too much empire, too much imperium, too much dominion, and that's going to destroy liberty. So their view, the radical Whigs are, whether they're the Wilkesites, and that is the followers of John Wilkes, Wilkes and Liberty, or the parliamentary reformers, the gentlemen supporters of the Bill of Rights, or the Society of the Supporters of the Bill of Rights in Great Britain in the 1760s, or they're the colonial American resistance movement, the Sons of Liberty, in colonial British North America in the 1760s. These radical Whigs and radical patriots on both sides of the Atlantic think that essentially they have to defend liberty against too much empire, too much imperium, and in order to save the empire of liberty. So they do that, Clint, by basically essentially organizing both in Britain and in colonial British North America to reform the British political order at home and abroad. And the radical Whigs in the colonies, when they realize that the radical Whigs are never going to be successful in Britain, they have to hit the escape hatch. And in hitting the escape hatch, they move for American independence. And American independence is not simply declaring the independence of the United States, it's also tearing down the previous existing system of political authority, the imperial and colonial institutions in colonial British North America, and replacing them, supplanting them with a whole new system of political authority, which is Republican political authority. So during the American Revolution, from roughly early 1776 through to the early 1780s, we see the slow tearing down. I mean, basically, imperial authority had been undermined everywhere in the colonies by 1774. That is, by the year 1774, which I think the historian Mary Beth Norton rightly sees this kind of crux year of, she calls it the year of revolution. It's really the crux. That's the year in which we basically have two coexisting systems of authority. We have the legitimate system of authority, that is the British imperial authority flowing from Parliament and the Crown, and we have this alternative structure of government that has been created by colonial American civil society itself, by county and town meetings, by civil associations. They've created committees of correspondence, committees of security, committees of inspection that create this shadow government. And these both exist. And basically what happens, Clint, by 1776 is this shadow government, right, wholly supersedes this legitimate imperial government. These provincial congresses and conventions that have absolutely no authority. Remember, all of these committees of security, these committees of correspondence created in 1774 and 1775, all of these provincial congresses and provincial conventions created in 1776, they have no actual authority. They're wholly illegitimate. What really has authority are the pre-existing imperial institutions, the colonial assemblies and the royal governors. What happens in the early phase of the American Revolution is you get the supplanting, the replacement of the pre-existing legitimate imperial and colonial authorities by new Republican political authorities. These committees of correspondence, these committees of inspection and security, these provincial congresses and conventions are turning themselves into Republican governments founded on what they describe as the authority of the people or the sovereignty of the people and written constitutions. In fact, basically John Adams, everybody can see that independence is coming by the spring of 1776. You've had a whole series of pamphlets published in the winter and early spring of 1776 advocating for independence, most famously Thomas Paine's Common Sense. And that's persuaded American public opinion, colonial American public opinion, towards independence. And as a result, the radicals within the Second Continental Congress, people like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, know that they now have the warrant from colonial American public opinion to move towards independence. So they begin writing these advisory documents, which they're sending out to all these revolutionary, illegitimate provincial congresses and conventions in the 13 colonies. They're writing all these letters and these draft statements to these illegitimate provincial congresses and conventions from Georgia in the south to New Hampshire in the north, saying, okay, you now have to transform yourself from illegitimate to legitimate bodies. The most famous of these correspondence is John Adams' Thoughts on Government, where he basically says, you now have to transform yourself from illegitimate to legitimate institutions, from institutions founded on the authority of Parliament and the Crown to institutions founded on the authority of the people, from institutions founded on the sovereignty of the Crown and Parliament to institutions founded on the sovereignty of the people. And that means you basically have to form Republican institutions based on written constitutions. And why am I emphasizing this, Clint? Because this shows a shift from what we could call the tearing down phase of the revolution to the building up phase of the revolution. Now people who had been about resisting imperial reforms and advocates of pan-imperial reform, right? And basically taking up arms and tearing down imperial structures now have to think about how to build new structures. Since the 1760s, the people who become the American revolutionaries, capital A, capital R, have largely been resistors, reformers, and revolutionaries, terror downs of legitimate institutions and building up embryonically illegitimate ad hoc institutions simply to prosecute their immediate political purposes. But now they move to a creative phase where they actually have to think, how do we create permanent institutions? How do we do that? Okay. Now, this enters into what I would call the kind of building up phase, the creative, productive phase of the American Revolution. And here, Clint, what we could say, by and large, the people who do this are informed by the previous decade and a half. Remember, from 1760 to 1775, they've been resistors and reformers and revolutionaries. And they've had to think about, how do we prevent too much empire, too much imperium, too much dominion, too much power, and how do we preserve liberty? And now they're the architects of a new order. And what they basically do is they overcorrect, we might say, for liberty. Okay, they create often these states based on written constitutions and Republican forms, create often unicameral legislators, right, that are not divided. And they create governors that are not independently elected, but rather simply appointed by the unicameral legislatures, right? And they don't even often create independent judiciaries. And these unicameral legislatures are made sort of extremely representative of the people because basically they create incredibly expansive and proportionate franchises. So what we could say, Clint, is they go very far in the direction of what we might call democracy, right? Trying to create a collective political liberty, trying to give people as much say in political authority, in government and power as they can. But remember, they're informed by the fact that the entire imperial crisis, from their perspective, had been a threat from authority, from imperium, from power to crush liberty. So as a result, they're overcorrecting and trying to create what they see as the greatest amount of liberty. And to do that, they create incredible political liberty, or what we might call democracy. They expand the franchise and they make the franchise much more rational, proportionate, meaning they make it actually representative to population. And they create incredibly frequent elections every year, every other year, and they create incredibly unicameral democratic legislatures. And the goal here is to try and give the people as much say as possible, because their view is that political authority was growing too great under the empire. So now we need to expand political liberty. But what happens, Clint, is between 1776 and the early 1780s, when they're no longer the terrors down of an old imperial system, but the building up, the architects of a new republican system, many of the leading lights of the American Revolution come to realize that they have gone too far in the direction of political liberty, of democracy. And they have actually created something that is a threat to what they concede to be the most fundamental form of liberty, which is civil liberty. Okay? Because all of these far more democratic, these far more representative, often unicameral legislatures that appoint the governors and appoint the judges. So think about this, Clint. We not only don't have multicameral or bicameral legislatures, we have unicameral legislatures in many of these colonies turned Republican states that basically are extremely representative to a wide swath of the electorate. And they appoint the judges, they appoint the governors, right? You create these incredibly democratic systems, and suddenly you get in a lot of these colonies basically democratic majoritarian threats to things like private property and public credit and civil liberty. Now, this becomes the breeding ground for the progressive narrative about the American Revolution. I'll stop there, Clint, because I may have gone too far afield from your concern.
Well, I mean, but this is now getting to the meat of it. So if we have in view, right, that what Marx is already talking about with the English Civil War, that you can't just say, oh, if the levelers and the diggers if they had just won, then we would have had communism in 1648 or something sort of like that. That it's just about a popular result, a popular revolt, and the redistribution of property. That's what constitutes the social thrust of a political revolution, right? So how is this swing back to order? Which, of course, the progressive narrative would just say is a class interest, right? It's just that the Jeffersonian landowners, the landowners just want to keep their interest payments, and therefore we need to have like a Senate and an independent judiciary and all these sorts of things are just a sort of developing sort of class interest. But how should we see this swing back towards order that is being attempted with the architecture of the Constitution to be enabling the further expansion of civil society? So how is this? So how and further, like the division of powers, how is this division of powers and what becomes the architecture of the Constitution? How is this supposed to be expanding civil society? Because we also need to have in mind here, I'm not sure this has been clear throughout, but we're talking about an era that has not yet industrialized, proletarianized. We're not talking yet about mass democracy and welfare being thought of as something that is coming from the state. Right, where I'm at, this is still the world of burgeoning bourgeois society, the wealth of nations, and the expansion of social dynamism, association, and new ideas. So, to come back to it, how is this how is too much democracy going to actually undermine the very expansion of wealth, property, and civil liberty that was the goal of the emancipation from serfdom?
That's a great question. So because this, you're exactly right. This is where the progressives really take hold, right? Their claim is, oh yes, there had been this extremely democratic revolution from below in the mid 1770s to early 1780s. And they would agree with everything I've said so far. They'd said this was this is completely right. And basically what the realization of this is, in fact, these extremely democratic unicameral legislatures that are created, right? That basically the progressives, whether we're talking about the late 19th, early 20th century progressives, most famously Carl Becker, Woodrow Wilson, Charles Beard, or we're talking about the progressives today. And by the way, I mean, Jacobin magazine, I mean, the DSA, they all push this stuff. They love this phase of the American Revolution. They think there was a democratic revolution from below that realized itself in these very democratic majoritarian institutions such as unicameral legislatures based on frequent elections with very broad and proportionate franchises, right, including wide swaths of the adult male population. So I think classical Marxism completely would have rejected this narrative, and I think we should reject it. But I think if we're going to reject it, we should not straw man it. We should go on to their strongest ground. Their strongest ground, because there are many examples I could give you of the violation of individual minority civil rights that happened in this period. Okay. But where we should go is precisely the questions of private credit and public credit, right? Either lending money privately between people in civil society or public credit, right? Like lending money to political authorities, right? Whether we're talking about private credit or public credit. This is the great ground of the progressive narrative, right? Oh, one of the reasons why they go to form the Constitution is because all of these popular parties formed in the previous colonies, now Republican states, that were able to get democratically elected, and they could basically support debtors and cancel credit. They could be in favor of a majority of people who were impoverished and indebted, and they could cancel debt, credit lines, etc. Right? That takes different forms. You could get there were popular parties that basically wanted to annihilate all debt. There were popular parties that wanted to annihilate state debt, all of that kind of stuff, right? The problem with that is that credit, public and private, is fundamental to a society of free labor. To the society of free labor, to the society of bourgeois labor, credit and debt are fundamental. They are not chains of dependence. They are chains of independence. Meaning, if society is not simply to call on its present means, but is also to call on it what has the potential to develop in the future, you need credit and debt. Credit is bringing future potential to bear on the present, to realize itself, right? All credit and debt in a bourgeois society, all private credit, public debt, is premised on the idea that society will continue to improve and grow. And if we can set up a system that allows us not to immediately have to produce resources to achieve what we want to achieve, but rather can call on future promises to achieve what we want to achieve. Now, we can even expand and grow more quickly, right? So the society of the free labor, of the bourgeois labor, right? The society of the free woman, the society of the free man is necessarily, the bourgeois society is necessarily a society in which the present needs to be able to call on the future to fully realize itself. And debt credit relations are fundamentally part of that, right? Otherwise, you're just dealing with a system of barter, right? Let me try to give you an example of this. If I'm an artisan in Pennsylvania, if I'm an artisan in say, 1780 Philadelphia, okay? And basically, I decide I would actually really, I actually think that I could, basically move out from Philadelphia to one of these towns developing on the western frontier, like Carlisle in western Pennsylvania. And I could actually set up there a more sophisticated shop. I could provide more for the family farmers that make up central Pennsylvania, all of that, right? Like, I will call on credit to be able to move myself and my family from Philadelphia to Carlisle, right? Or if I'm in Virginia, from Newport to Alexandria. If I'm moving myself inward, I'll call on credit to set up there, right? To move myself, credit and debt. This is not just, credit and debt is not just fat cats, right? It's essential for people to be able to basically try and do something now that they could not do now on the basis of the present resources they have. They basically, people who are calling on capital being lent to them are saying effectively, I actually think I can produce more wealth, more value for society in the long run than I can now. But I need to institute all of these changes. Maybe I have to move from Philadelphia to Carlisle. Maybe I have to move out of my artisanal workshop and set up a manufacturing center right side out of Philadelphia. I need all of these loans to do now what I can't. But ultimately, not only will I repay these loans, I'll create more wealth for myself, more jobs, more cheaper products, more wealth for society as a whole, right? Like, credit and debt are essential. So we as Marxists should go right on the progressive ground. There are many examples we could use of violations of individual minority rights in this period, of religious majorities riding roughshod over religious minorities, of congregationalist majorities riding roughshod over Baptists, all of that, right? Of religious majorities riding roughshod over religious minorities. But let's go on to their ground, debtors and creditors, right? Bourgeois labor, free labor has an interest in credit and debt, both individually to transform your own life and collectively to transform society as a whole. And so if majorities can come in and cancel credit and debt, you will undermine the well springs of a commercial society, a bourgeois society. That means that no one, right, will be able to raise the resources from others to do things that they can't do with their own resources. That restricts the development, what the future could be, to what the present is capable of doing. Whereas if you can bring the future to call in the present, you can make the future even more expansive than it otherwise could be, right? So this undermines the whole well springs of commercial or bourgeois society. And yeah, does it benefit creditors, bankers, the wealth? Sure, but it will eventually trickle down and affect every person in society, everybody who has aspirations to not be a dependent laborer in Philadelphia for their artisan, but to go out to that new town that's developing, Carlisle, and set up their own shop, right? And everybody who has aspirations to do that is going to be stopped from doing that. Every family farm that wants to borrow a bit of money, and many family farmers are borrowing money at this age, because as you said, this is a pre-industrial era. The fundamental social unit of colonial America are family farms. Those family farms can only improve and produce a better lifestyle because they can trade a bit of their they can not only trade a bit of their surplus, but take a debt that allows them to buy new tools and implements in the markets, in the villages, that they can reapply and create even more of a surplus to pay back their debt and use other things to even diversify what they're producing. So all of life depends on credit and debt. And majorities being able to willy-nilly cancel and credit debt is as tyrannous as a king canceling a debt. And I know that there are many people in the audience that will loathe what I'm about to say, but basically a Democratic majority in Rhode Island canceling private and public debt is as arbitrary a power as Charles II, who canceled the debt in 1670, I don't remember the year, in the 1670s in England, or Louis XIV, as arbitrary an interference in society, right?
Right. And so what you're saying then is that the ability to cancel debt is actually undermining the very expansion of free labor that debt is taken on for, and because we also have this notion, when we think of democracy, we immediately think of plebiscitary democracy, and when we think of society, we think of it as just merely distribution and consumption, and really what's going on here is, how can, from what I'm understanding what you're saying, is that the interesting part about these enlightened landowning gentry who are lending out money, basically, because if I understand correctly, it's not really the land that they're making money from. It's because they're lending out money, and that's what's actually spurring on society. So we can't collapse. So we can't say that there's already a class division in the Marxist sense between like the anti-federalists and the federalists. That really what we have here is two different aspects of the negotiation of the expansion of bourgeois labor.
Precisely. I mean, it's bankers and merchants mostly lending the money to family farmers and planters. But it's precisely what you just said, right? It's basically, right, it's the self-development of bourgeois society. We're not dealing with a class differentiation here, right? Meaning credit and debt, right? Credit and debt is absolutely fundamental and necessary to bourgeois society. In fact, an index of the development of bourgeois society from the Renaissance on has been the expansion of finance, right? That's a classical index of it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's a big thing that we need to be thinking about, is the different sort of relationship that we have in this bourgeois expansion of finance, and then once you have industrialization and finance capital, and what the difference between those is expressing socially about the value of labor as a dynamic concept.
That's right. That's right. And it's really in this period, right, where the progressives hang their hat, right, that effectively what I would say is leading elements of the American revolutionary movement come to think that in going too far in the direction of political liberty, they're actually undermining civil liberty, by which I mean the liberty of society as a whole and of the individuals who compose it.
Right. And just so that people are clear, right, like the idea that we can all associate, go where you please, associate with whom you please, and take the job that you please, that is actually what is making a dynamic society beyond agricultural civilization. That is civil liberty is something that has gone beyond like what we might call, ancient political democracy, where it's just like the will of the majority and there's no minority right, and the will of the majority can just assert itself.
Yeah, civil liberty is the liberty collectively and individually of those free relations in daily life. The freedom to enter into contract, exchange, association, to create institutions and associations based on consent, by which people can achieve together things they can't achieve on their own, to read and write and to publish newspapers and books and periodicals, right? What I mean by civil liberty are all of those social and individual rights to assemble, to speak, to organize, to contract, to petition, that allows basically for society to it's a whole realm of freedom in daily life that is simply totally beyond political liberty. Can I give you a sense? Can I read you a quote, Clint? Would that be okay?
Go right ahead.
This is from a book that is, so this is a radical Whig author in Britain, okay? But I think it perfectly captures this distinction, right? Of course, most famously, this distinction is made in Benjamin Constant's The Liberty of the Ancients Compared with That of the Moderns, a lecture he gives in Restoration France, I believe in 1818 or 1819, where he separates ancient liberty from modern liberty. But what's fundamental to understand is that Constant is simply summarizing in a speech a whole series of theoretical and intellectual working outs that have already taken place in the British imperial world, meaning authors, radical authors in both Britain and colonial British North America have already made this distinction between ancient liberty and modern liberty, and this distinction between political liberty and civil liberty, right? Constant is a great thing to give people because you can give a young person 20 pages and read it all there. But this is actually, this distinction is something that is worked out from the British imperial crisis and the American Revolution itself. Rather, the political theory is the after effect of having to work this out in practice, right? And radical Whigs on both sides of the Atlantic, and above all, this segment of the American revolutionaries that realize that they've gone too far with political liberty and are threatening civil liberty, they're the ones who really work out clearly, long before, decades before Constant, the distinction between ancient liberty and modern liberty. And they call modern liberty civil liberty, and they call ancient liberty political liberty. So let me give you a great example of this. This is from the book by the radical Whig called Constitution of England, that's published in 1788. And this radical Whig says, to concur by one's suffrage in enacting laws is to enjoy a share, whatever it may be, of power. Notice what he's saying there, Clint. To concur by one's suffrage in enacting laws is to enjoy a share, whatever it may be, of power. He's saying that political liberty, that right to vote, is not actually liberty, it's power. It's a share of power. And he goes on to say, so far as it is possible for it to, then he goes on to say, while liberty, so far it is possible for it to exist in a society of beings whose interests are almost perpetually opposed to each other, consists in this, that every man, while he respects the persons of others and allows them quietly to enjoy the produce of their industry, be certain himself likewise to enjoy the produce of his own industry, and that his person be also secure. Right? He's saying there, to concur by one's suffrage in enacting laws is to enjoy a share, whatever it may be, of power, not of liberty.
Right.
Right? Liberty, civil liberty, is the liberty, right, so far it is possible for it to exist in a society of beings whose interests are almost perpetually opposed to each other, consists in this, that every man, while he respects the persons of others and allows them quietly to enjoy the produce of their industry, be certain himself likewise to enjoy the produce of his own industry, and that his person be also secure. Civil liberty. That's genuine freedom, right? Not a share of power. Rather, it's the ability to determine the course of your own life individually and with others collectively in the free relations of everyday life. Civil liberty, to associate with who you want to love who you want to marry who you want to live where you want to, for work for you want to do what you want to with your labor who you want to exchange with what you want to write what you want to read what you want to worship God as you want to, right? All of that is genuine liberty. And all suffrage is not a share of liberty, but a share of power. So genuine civil liberty is that liberty in society as a collective and individual liberty, a collective and individual realm. So the problem, Clint, that has arisen for the American revolutionaries is they've defeated too much power in the empire of liberty. They've defeated a power, an empire, an imperium, a dominion that was threatening to become completely unresponsive, unaccountable, inadequate to the sense of the people, the sense of society. But now they've gone too far in the direction of liberty, political liberty. So they've really got to think about how does one, right, actually create the empire of liberty, properly balance power and liberty. Because by creating too much liberty in the political sense, Clint, what they've done is they've done away with parliamentary absolutism, and they now face the threat of democratic absolutism. Of course, Alexis de Tocqueville famously gave this the name of tyranny of the majority, but despite Tocqueville's great self-promotion, he did not come up with it. He is simply reading the papers and the works of the British imperial crisis and the American Revolution, where he can see clearly that they're overturning this threat of an absolute power previously rooted in the king, absolute monarchy, now rooted in the parliament, absolute parliament, but they've created this new threat, the threat that the tyranny of a majority can have over a minority, or the threat that a collectivity of interests and factions that can accumulate into a majority can have over society as a whole. Remember, Clint, the American revolutionaries are deeply rooted in the High Enlightenment. The Enlightenment started in the late 17th century with figures like Locke and Pufendorf, but it really enters in the High Enlightenment, right, with figures like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the Scottish Enlightenment, theory of moral sentiments in the 1750s, Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, 1776. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's principal publications are the 1750s and early 1760s. James Otis Jr. and the colonies, other types of figures. And the central realization of the Enlightenment is the political order must be adequate to the general will. The High Enlightenment says that the political authority, power, authority, must serve the general interests of society. And the general interest of society, Clint, is not simply the interest of the majority. That's just the despotism of a majority faction over society as a whole. The general will must serve society so every single group and individual in society can see their own interests and aspirations realized in it. Meaning, even though they may not immediately elect the legislatures or serve in the legislatures that pass those laws, the test of the High Enlightenment is they could see all of those laws as laws they would have passed. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, Jean-Jacques Rousseau is the one, all honor to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In the Social Contract of 1762, he famously systematizes it and gives it crystallizes its meaning in the general will. But across the Western world, including in Britain and in the colonies, the category of general will exists before Jean-Jacques Rousseau writes the Social Contract. And the core of the general will is precisely how Rousseau begins the Social Contract, which is people have an interest, right, in forming society, because in the state of nature they cannot overcome obstacles. Therefore, they want to come together collectively. They have a social instinct. They form society, and in society together they can overcome nature and transform the world and create a whole new world of potentials and possibilities they wouldn't otherwise have. But as Rousseau and a number of other authors, including John Adams, who's writing this already in the early 1760s, right, say is the great misfortune is when humans left the state of nature, they tend, when they create these collective societies, to actually exploit and oppress and enslave themselves more than they did in the state of nature, right? So how do we actually create a free society, right? And that's the desideratum of the general will, meaning not a society in which simply a majority, which after all is just the biggest faction or interest group, can realize its aspiration in the law, but rather in which every particular faction, interest, and individual can basically say, irrespective of whether or not I sat in the legislature or even had a vote in picking the representatives who became the lawmakers, I can nevertheless say that this law that I must follow, this heteronomy, this law being imposed upon me from without, is also a product of my autonomy. I would otherwise have imposed it on myself. Right? I can reconcile autonomy and heteronomy, a law proposed from without that nevertheless would be a law that you would give to yourself. And that's the general will. And what they're coming to realize, what the American revolutionaries are coming to realize in the later 1770s and the early 1780s, is they've gone too far in the direction of political liberty, of what we might call democracy, and created a threat to the general will, to the idea, right, that the state should serve not simply a majority of society, but should serve society as a whole, the general will of society, such that every interest, every faction, every individual could see their aspirations realized, right, in the law that was organizing society, the rule of law. Right. They're realizing, to just put a capstone on this, that they've overthrown a despotic parliament and created a despotic majority, or they risk creating a despotic majority. And if I could just give you one example of this, which I quite like, because now I've gone on the progressive strongest ground. So now I'd really like to get them on particularly weak ground. This is from a debate. So basically by the mid 1780s, 1785, 1786, leading lights of the American Revolution are beginning to realize they really need to rethink how they've organized the Republican institutions within the state. And they need to rethink how they've organized the Articles of Confederation. In other words, we're headed towards the Annapolis Convention that meets in Annapolis, Maryland, but doesn't succeed. And then the later convention in the summer of 1787, the Philadelphia Convention, that succeeds in drafting. They ignore the Articles of Confederation. They draft a wholly new framework government, the federal constitution, which is ultimately ratified. And Madison, in a speech he's trying to give in this earlier period, so in 1785, 1786, already leading lights of the American Revolution, Madison, an extremely young man, protege of Thomas Jefferson. Already people are saying we've gone too far. We've overthrown one form of tyranny, a parliamentary absolutist tyranny, and behind that a absolute royal tyranny, right, in favor of what's become a kind of democratic tyranny. So if I can just lay out to you what Madison says, because this becomes the basis of the federal constitution and the most famous Federalist paper in defense of the federal constitution, Federalist number 10, which Madison famously writes, right? If any of your listeners would like verification of what I'm saying, just tonight after this or wherever you see this, open your copy of the Federalist Papers and read Federalist number 10. It's all in there, but here's the first articulation of that. Okay, so he's basically talking in this speech he's giving at this earlier convention meeting that takes place when people are already seeing the problem of the fact you're getting kind of a democratic majorities that are kind of tyrannous or arbitrary in their own right, or they're developing. And he basically says, he says this, he says, sorry, I apologize for the delay. The conduct of every popular assembly acting on oath, the strongest of religious ties, proves that individuals join without remorse in acts against which their consciences would revolt if proposed to them under the like sanction separately in their closets. What he's going to elaborate from there is effectively, you will do in majorities what you conceive of your own interest, with if in a private audience somebody could point out to you that another majority could form against your own interest on some other case, you would not accept, right? So
Right.
I, as a Congregationalist, might accept passing a law in a Democratic Assembly against the Baptists or against Jews or Muslims, right? But I would realize in another instance where I may be a creditor that I wouldn't like debtors being able to use the same Democratic majorities to cancel credit, right? He's pointing this out. And he goes on to say, place three individuals in a situation wherein the interest of each depends on the voice of the others, and give to two of them an interest opposed to the rights of the third. Will the latter be secure? The prudence of every man would shun the danger, meaning two would form an absolute majority over the third. The rules and forms of justice suppose and guard against it. Will 2,000 in a like situation be less likely to encroach on the rights of 1,000? The contrary is witnessed by the notorious factions and oppressions which take place in corporate towns, limited as the opportunities are, and in little republics when uncontrolled by apprehensions of external danger. He's basically pointing out, right, that basically it's in these small democratic republics where you risk these tyranny of the majorities, okay? And he basically says, now what's his response? He says, the great desideratum in government is such a modification of the sovereignty as will render it sufficiently neutral between the different interests and factions to control one part of the society from invading the rights of another, and at the same time sufficiently controlled itself from setting up an interest adverse to that of the whole of society, right? So he's saying, sure, absolute monarchy, absolute parliament erected a minority interest against the majority of society. But what we're doing now is creating a majority interest, these democratic assemblies that are against minorities in society. And that both these forms, whether it's a minority interest in absolute monarchy and absolute parliament tyrannizing over society, or it's a majority tyrannizing over a minority, both of these interests are arbitrary powers against the general interest of society, right? So he writes, in absolute monarchies, the prince is, he argues, in absolute monarchies, the prince is sufficiently neutral towards his subjects, but frequently sacrifices their happiness to his ambition or his avarice, rules in favor of himself instead of society as a whole. In small republics, the sovereign will is sufficiently controlled from such a sacrifice of the entire society, but is not sufficiently neutral towards the parts composing it, meaning a majority takes control and reigns over the minorities. As a limited monarchy tempers the evils of an absolute one, so an extensive republic meliorates the administration of a small republic. An auxiliary desideratum for the melioration of the republican form is such a process of elections that will most certainly extract from the mass of society the purest and noblest characters which it contains. Okay, so here he's basically laid out, Clint, if I can, the danger of democratic assemblies, right? He's pointing to this, and he basically says, these observations are verified by the histories of every country, ancient and modern. In Greece and Rome, the rich and poor, the creditors and debtors, as well as the patricians and plebeians, alternately oppressed each other with equal unmercifulness. What a source of oppression was the relation between the parent cities of Rome, Athens, and Carthage and their respective provinces, the former possessing the power and the latter being sufficiently distinguished to be separate objects of it. Why was America so justly apprehensive of parliamentary injustice? Because Great Britain had a separate interest, real or supposed, and if her authority had been admitted, could have pursued that interest at our expense. And this is the crux, Clint, and here's where I really want to get the progressives. We have seen the mere distinction of color made in the most enlightened period of time a ground of the most oppressive dominion ever exercised by man over man. What Madison is pointing out is that democracy, laws passed by the majority, have been responsible for slavery, for enslaving people. Again, I'll just remind the audience, right? We have seen the mere distinction of color, black and white, made in the most enlightened period of time a ground of the most oppressive dominion ever exercised by man over man. You want to love this period? You want to love progressiveness? You've got to understand that slavery itself is a product of the outcome of democratic assemblies, right? That also, so you have to shift your ground to basically thinking about civil liberty, to thinking about the will of the interest and will of society as a whole against any particular interest or faction, above all against even a majority interest or faction, a tyranny of the majority, if you will.
I mean, that is the through line to proletarian assertion of the general will. Meaning, like, the idea, basically what the progressives are doing, it seems, based on what you just said, based on this is a very provocative and mind-opening. But when the progressives are saying that the public interest in the form of the state over against the Constitution, which is a class document, they're actually eliminating the possibility, or they're ignoring the possibility, or they're neglecting, or they're just giving up on the possibility that society could have a general will.
Yes, they're completely abandoning. They are setting up a power which risks becoming tyrannous over society as a whole and over the minority groups and interests and individuals that compose it. They're
right.
part of it.
Right. And so it actually is that idea that you just kind of learn in high school that, oh, well, you're supposed to have, you have this antagonism of interests, and there has to be something that's the good of all. There has to be something that is in the interest of all of society, even if that is not reducible to any number one of its parts.
Yes.
And that is that is what is actually being that is what is completing this positive dialectic, if you will, between power and liberty, empire and freedom. That is how that's being completed in the architecture of the Union, of the Constitution.
That is the genius of these American revolutionary architects that realize they've gone too far in the direction of liberty insofar as they've expanded political liberty, which has become a threat to this much more greater and important liberty to them, which is civil liberty.
Exactly. And we forget that. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, because we entirely forget that, like, political power is for the sake of society. That political power by itself is always just means that something is not going right in society. And that the entire point of politics is to return to society.
Yes. Yeah, precisely. And not simply the rulers, that is the kings or the parliaments, can be a threat to society, but the people themselves can be a threat to society. If I could just read you one more from this Madison speech, he writes, this is again one of these earlier conventions before the actual successful convention that takes place in Philadelphia. He says, a still more fatal, if not more frequent cause, he's talking about why republics fail, okay, lies among the people themselves. All civilized societies are divided into different interests and factions, as they happen to be creditors or debtors, rich or poor, husbandmen, merchants, or manufacturers, members of different religious sects, followers of different political leaders, inhabitants of different districts, owners of different kinds of property, etc., etc. In republican government, the majority, however composed, ultimately give the law. Whenever, therefore, an apparent interest or common passion unites a majority, what is to restrain them from unjust violations of the rights and interests of the minority or of individuals? So he's now saying, we've gone from this tyranny of the parliament or the king to this tyranny of the majority. So what can we possibly do to restrain this tyranny? or potential tyranny. And he says, three motives only. One, a prudent regard to their own good as involved in the general and permanent good of the community. Meaning, if a majority interest sets itself up and rides roughshod on minority interests, they are violating their own general will, the general will, their own interest in society. Because remember, you may now be a member of a religious majority, but maybe you're a member of a financial minority. Maybe you're a member of a majority form of property ownership, but maybe you're in a religious minority. Maybe you're a member of a majority of skin color, but you might be a minority of religion, right? The point he's saying there is people need to realize they have to have a prudent regard to their own good as involved in the general and permanent good of the community. This consideration, although of decisive weight in itself, is found by experience to be too often unheeded. It is often forgotten by nations as well as by individuals that honesty is the best policy. Secondly, respect for character. However strong this motive may be in individuals, it is considered as very insufficient to restrain them from injustice. In a multitude, its efficacy is diminished in proportion to the number which is to share the praise or the blame. Besides, as it has reference to public opinion, which within a particular society is the opinion of the majority, the standard is fixed by those whose conduct is to be measured by it. The public opinion without the society will be little respected by the people at large of any country. Okay, he goes on and on. What he's trying to point out is effectively that the problem is that, yes, even the greatest majorities, 99.99999% of society, it's ultimately in their best interest to serve the general will, the general interest of society, than their 99.99% majority interest, right? Because they will, in other respects, be minorities and not majorities, right? They will destroy the freedom problem that's solved by a public order organized around the general will, right?
And that's what, yeah.
Just to finish this one point. So the problem on the table, therefore, by 1784, 1775, 1786 is not, how do we property elites defend our government securities and our vast speculative land speculations westward? It's rather, right, how do we preserve the general will, the general interests of society, not only have we've already done a good job of against the despotism of political authority, but the potential despotism of political liberty. How do we preserve the general will, the general interests of society against not only absolute monarchs and parliaments, but against absolute majority? Absolutely.
And that general will is simply the ability of society to transform itself.
Yes, absolutely. And that is the fundamental cauldron in which the architecture of the new framework of government, that is the federal constitution, is brewed. Okay. Yeah. That is the fundamental architecture of government that creates the Constitution. And that's why the progressives are wrong. The passage of the Constitution in the drafting of the Constitution in 1787 and its ultimate ratification in 1788 is seen by progressives as the victory of a counter-revolution. Now, where do they attempt to make their point? They make their point that all of the delegates who gather in Philadelphia at this convention, at this convention in the summer of 1787, they are not authorized to create a new framework of government. They are authorized to simply improve upon, to reform the Articles of Confederation. But they have all decided, or the vast majority of them have decided long before they've arrived in Philadelphia, that the Articles of Confederation are unworkable. So immediately when they gather in Philadelphia in May, they decide effectively not to try and improve or reform the Articles of Confederation, but to draft an entire new framework of national government altogether, right? Which they ultimately achieved by September, the end of the summer of 1787, the federal constitution. And they get ratified by 1788, right? Meaning the necessary 9 of the 13 Republican states join and form this new federal union. Now, the progressives see that as the founders' coup or the framers' coup. But it's not. It's really an attempt to finally secure once and for all this empire of liberty, right? The British Empire went too far in the direction of empire, power, imperium. They've now gone too far in the direction of political liberty, right? Now these things have to be properly balanced such that you can really have, right, an empire of liberty that expands. And while it expands, it still remains accountable, governable according to its civil society, right? And you need to be able to protect civil liberty. So basically, their goal, Clint, is twofold. When they gather in Philadelphia in 1787, and what they achieve in this new framework of government they create, the federal constitution, they achieve two things, okay? One, the Articles of Confederation is unworkable at many levels. One, it doesn't have an army, right? Which means you've got, remember, the Articles of Confederation is not really a national government. It's a treaty between sovereign states. The Articles of Confederation creates a confederacy of sovereign states. This is the lie, ultimately, of the Southern Confederacy that attempts to succeed from the Union, right? There had been such a confederacy already. It was supplanted in 1788, right? The Articles of Confederation is not really a national government. It's really a peace treaty, a league, a peace treaty between sovereign states who pool some of their sovereignty together for specific purposes. But otherwise, they have all of these sovereign powers themselves, right? They have a great degree of their own power over their foreign relations, over their right to raise an army, over their right to tax, over their right to coin, all of that. So as a result, you have no unified economy. You have no unified commercial space across the now independent colonies. You have a lot of independent diplomacy going on. You have border wars and land disputes going on between Virginia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Virginia, all of that kind of stuff. Right? You have a real risk of disunion, of collapse, as all these little sovereign powers, right? So ultimately, what they want to do, that is the architects of the federal constitution, is they want to create a much stronger national government, right? They realize that they've done too much to dismantle power. They've broken up power too much. They've dismantled imperium, dominion, empire power too much. They need a great national government that can project power over their borders against other European powers and against Native American powers, and also overseas. They need a great power capable of conducting diplomacy, of external defense, of overseas expansion. They need all of that, right? They want a new powerful national state. But they realize they don't want to do what the British were doing. They don't want to create an empire that will snuff out political and, even more importantly, civil liberty, right? They want to create a new national state, much more powerful than the Articles of Confederation, but they're worried that if they create one too powerful, they will snuff out political liberty and civil liberty, right? The freedoms of groups and individuals, okay? They'll destroy the freedom of society because it will become this overweening monster that basically, like, the new national system will be even worse than the old British imperial system. On the other hand, they also want to control for too much political liberty, too much democracy undermining civil liberty, right? So what they decide is they want a system where no majority faction can permanently consolidate itself and be in control, right? So they effectively decide that the ancient authors like Cicero and Cato and the early modern authors like Montesquieu and Pufendorf were right, that you couldn't have a democratic republic except over a small extent of territory. That was their view, because those authors were only focused on political liberty, right? The liberty, the amount of power people actually had, right? But rather, if you focused on civil liberty, which your freedom to develop on your own individually and collectively in society, not being interfered with by an arbitrary power, whether it's a king, a parliament, or a majority in a democratic assembly. If you care about civil liberty, then what you want to do is expand the territory of the democratic republic. That is the great genius of the architects of the federal constitution. And I cannot emphasize this enough. American political thinking is often misunderstood. People will say there is no great American political thinking. That's because they don't realize that American political thinking was not intellectually reflective. It wasn't a republic of letters sitting in studies and coffee houses drawing it up abstractly. All power to that. All honor to Montesquieu and Rousseau and Locke and all of those people. I've learned a great deal from them. Political theory in colonial British North America and the United States is the American Revolution. It's this practical experience that presents a cauldron for systematic political reflection by a kind of society and revolution on itself and how it's developing itself, right? And this really leads, Clint, to thinking about representation unlike ever before. You can go through the Federalist Papers, and whether you're reading ones written by James Madison, Thomas Jefferson's protege, and the grand architect of the federal Constitution, or you're reading ones by Alexander Hamilton, or you're reading ones by John Jay, the kind of great New Yorker American revolutionaries, Jay and Hamilton, right? Whether you're reading whichever paper, they're all talking about the ancients had no system of representation. The ancients didn't understand representation, right? If you'll spare me reading you just very quickly, this is from Federalist number 9 by Alexander Hamilton. He says, he's talking about how all the ancient authors, Cicero, who have you, all the way up to more recent authors like the great baron or the great civilian. When the American revolutionaries talk about the baron or the civilian, they mean Montesquieu. The term the civilian means Montesquieu, or the baron means Montesquieu. And they're talking about how all of these people always said you could only have a democratic republic over a small extent of territory. And what Hamilton's pointing out, that's because they only thought of ancient liberty, political liberty, the share people had in government. Rather, they didn't think about civil liberty of commercial society. That is, the liberty people have in their daily relations in everyday life. And Hamilton writes, from the disorders that disfigure the annals of those republics, the advocates of despotism have drawn arguments not only against the forms of republican government, but against the very principles of civil liberty. They have decried all free government as inconsistent with the order of society, and have indulged themselves in malicious exaltation over its friends and partisans. Meaning, basically, the advocates of absolute state authority, whether it's in the crown or it's in parliament, have basically said, you can't have too much, you can have too much civil liberty and that will destroy all good government, right? And look at the democratic republics of the ancient world. They lead to majority factions ruling and then minorities, because they're being oppressed by the majority, trying to overthrow the majority. There's constant discords. There's constant destruction. Basically, the advocates of absolute government, whether they're monarchists or parliamentarians, can say free government. Government can't work. A quasi-democratic or democratic government, free government can't work, because basically you get majorities who tyrannize over minorities, and that creates discord as the minorities rebel. Because the minorities either will be put to death or they become slaves, or in the ancient world, or they need to rebel, right? And so this, Hamilton is saying, gives heart to the advocates of despotism. But he says they don't understand civil liberty. He says, happily for mankind, stupendous fabrics reared on the basis of liberty, which have flourished for ages, have in a few glorious instances refuted their gloomy sophisms. And I trust America will be the broad and solid foundation of other edifices, not less magnificent, which will be equally permanent monuments of their errors. But it is not to be denied that the portraits they have sketched of Republican government were too just copies of the originals from which they were taken. Meaning they're right. The ancient republics, the early modern republics, had a bad history. So he writes, if it had been found impracticable to have devised models of a more perfect structure, the enlightened friends to liberty would have been obliged to abandon the cause of that species of government as indefensible. Meaning we have to give up this freer government we're advocating. We have to surrender to the friends of despotism. However, here's his riposte. The science of politics, however, like most other sciences, has received great improvement, right? Remember that, Clint. Ancient freedom believes that freedom is a once and for all thing. You can achieve a state of stasis, a state of perfection. You can figure out what liberty is and once and for all have it. Modern liberty is based on improvement or progress. The idea that things change and can constantly change, right? So he says here, the scientific of politics, however, like most other sciences, has received great improvement, a quintessentially bourgeois epochal statement, right? The efficacy of various principles is now well known, sorry, let me repeat that. The efficacy of various principles is now well understood, which were either not known at all or imperfectly known to the ancients. The ancients didn't know these things. The regular distribution of power into distinct departments, the introduction of legislative balances and checks, the institutions of courts composed of judges holding their offices during good behavior, the representation of the people in the legislature by deputies of their own election, i.e. not direct democracy, not ancient democracy, but representative democracy or liberal democracy. These, listen, this is very important for the audience. These are wholly new discoveries or have made their principal progress towards perfection in our modern times. They are means and powerful means by which the excellencies of Republican government may be retained and its imperfections lessened or avoided. To this catalog of circumstances that tend to the amelioration of popular systems of civil government, I shall venture, however novel it may appear to some, to add one more on a principle which has been made the foundation of an objection to the new Constitution. I mean the enlargement of the orbit within which such systems are to revolve, either in respect to the dimensions of a single state or to the consolidation of several smaller states into one great confederacy. Meaning what Hamilton is laying out there, that actually you need to think of democracy not as direct, but as representative democracy. You need to think of liberty not as ancient liberty, but civil liberty. The key thing you want in modern society is civil liberty. And the key to civil liberty is to have a government that's accountable to you. And a government can't be accountable to you if it's monopolized either by an absolute king / absolute parliament or an absolute majority. Rather, a government can be accountable to you if somehow you can transmit the sense of society, the sense of the people, public opinion to government, i.e. representative democracy, but that government itself is divided and put within restrictions and constraints that even the greatest majorities cannot possibly surpass, right? Even majorities of 99.99% cannot surpass. And Hamilton, of course, famously follows up on this by saying, the goal of all thinkers, the problem with enlightenment, he says, is that they've tried to eliminate interest and faction. If I can just read to you now from Madison, Jefferson's protege, Federalist number 10. He writes, and this is him building on Hamilton, but doing his own thing, right? This is really important. He writes, it is in vain to say that enlightened statesmen will be able to adjust these clashing interests and render them all subservient to the public good. You heard what I just said, right? It's in vain to think that you can reconcile clashing interests and impose a single public good on all of them, right? Now, I want to pause and remind the audience, James Madison is the youngest of the architects of the federal constitution, the youngest of the American revolutionaries. He had spent the immediate pre-revolutionary period at the College of New Jersey, where he was taught by a Scottish immigrant who was trained in the Scottish Enlightenment, the High Enlightenment. And he imbibed Millar and Ferguson. He remained a great follower in the Enlightenment. He imbibed Rousseau. The College of New Jersey, by the way, persists to this day. It's called Princeton, right? And at the College of New Jersey, he had this Scottish immigrant tutor who was steeped in the High Enlightenment, who was teaching him Rousseau, Millar, Ferguson, all of these people transforming and understanding of civil society. And Madison continues to remain a follower of Enlightenment thinking, particularly Scottish Enlightenment thinking, and is a great fan of Adam Smith's A Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. So when he writes this in late 1787, keep in mind, he's had now Adam Smith at his disposal for 11 years. It is vain to say that enlightened statesmen will be able to adjust these clashing interests and render them all subservient to the public good. Enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm, nor in many cases can such an adjustment be made at all without taking into view indirect and remote considerations, which will rarely prevail over the immediate interests which one party may find in disregarding the rights of another or the good of the whole. The inference to which we are brought is that the causes of faction cannot be removed, and that relief is only to be sought in the means of controlling its effects. Mm-hmm. In other words, he's saying you must accept unsocial sociability. What you must try and do is not repress it, but rather organize its effects. And he says, if a channel it, exactly. Those are even better words. Thank you, Clint. If a faction consists of less than a majority, relief is supplied by the Republican principle, which enables the majority to defeat its sinister views by regular vote. It may clog the administration, it may convulse the society, but it will be unable to execute and mask its violence under the forms of the Constitution. When a majority is included in a faction, in other words, when you have what Tocqueville calls the tyranny of the majority, democratic tyranny, right? When a majority is included in a faction, the form of popular government, on the other hand, enables it to sacrifice to its ruling passion or interest both the public good and the rights of other citizens, the minorities. To secure the public good and private rights against the danger of such a majority faction, and at the same time to preserve the spirit and the form of popular government, is then the great object to which our inquiries are directed. As Madison puts this in another speech, we must use democracy against democracy. Okay? And he says, to secure the public good and the private rights against the danger of such a faction, and at the same time to preserve the spirit and the form of popular government, is then the great object to which our inquiries are directed. Let me add that it is the great desideratum by which alone this form of government can be rescued from the opprobrium under which it has so long labored, been recommended to the esteem and adoption of mankind. So then he asks, by what means is this object attainable? Evidently by one of two only. Either the existence of the same passion or interest in the majority at the same time must be prevented, or the majority, having such coexistent passion or interest, must be rendered by their number and local situation unable to concert and carry into effect schemes of oppression. If the impulse and the opportunity be suffered to coincide, we will know that neither moral nor religious motives can be relied on as an adequate control. They are not found to be such on the injustice and violence of individuals and lose their efficacy in proportion to the number combined together, that is, in proportion as their efficacy becomes needful. And here's the key part. He says, from this view of the subject, it may be concluded that a pure democracy, by which I mean a society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person, can admit of no cure for the mischiefs of faction. Again, a pure democracy can admit of no cure for the mischiefs of faction. A pure democracy is horrible. Okay? A common passion or interest will, in almost every case, be felt by a majority of the whole. A communication and concert results from the form of government itself, and there is nothing to check the inducements to sacrifice the weaker party or an obnoxious individual. Hence it is that such democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. Theoretic politicians who have patronized this species of government have erroneously supposed that by reducing mankind to a perfect equality in their political rights, they would at the same time be perfectly equalized and assimilated in their possessions, their opinions, and their passions. Meaning they extend political liberty and they're leading to destroy civil liberty, right? Give everybody equality, but then make everybody in actual society be equal, right? Everybody gets to vote, but then majorities get to decide how everybody should live. That's terrible. That's political liberty destroying social liberty, civil liberty. He says a republic, which by I mean a government in which the scheme of representation takes place, opens a different prospect and promises the cure for which we are seeking. Let us examine the points in which it varies from pure democracy, and we shall comprehend both the nature of the cure and the efficacy which it must derive from this union, the federal union they're proposing. The two great points of difference between a democracy and a republic are, first, the delegation of the government in the latter to a small number of citizens elected by the rest. Secondly, the greater number of citizens in greater sphere of country over which the latter may be extended. Okay? Does that make sense? Because he's already said previously, the latent causes of faction are thus sown in the nature of man. And we see them everywhere brought into different degrees of activity, according to the different circumstances of civil society. A zeal for different opinions concerning religion, concerning government, and many other points, as well as speculation as a practice, an attachment to different leaders, ambitiously contending for preeminence and power, or to persons of other descriptions whose fortunes have been interesting to the human passions, have in turn divided mankind into parties, inflamed them with mutual animosity, and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for their common good. So strong is this propensity of mankind to fall into mutual animosities that where no substantial occasion presents itself, the most frivolous and fanciful distinctions have been sufficient to kindle their unfriendly passions and excite their most violent conflicts. But the most common and durable source of factions has been the various unequal distribution of property. Those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society. Those who are creditors and those who are debtors fall under a like discrimination. A landed interest, a manufacturing interest, a mercantile interest, a moneyed interest, with many lesser interests grow up of necessity in civilized nations and divide them into different classes, actuated by different sentiments and views. The regulation of these various and interfering interests forms the principal task of modern legislation and involves the spirit, faction, and party in the necessary and ordinary operations of government. What he basically is laying out in Federalist 10, Clint, right, is what Kant will call unsocial sociability. What Adam Smith will see as competition being able to be channeled in cooperation. What he essentially says is political authority has to be made accountable and responsible to society in a way that does not allow, right, a tyranny, a majority, to simply do tyrannically what a crown or a monarchy used to do. And so he says basically what we have to do is not try and eliminate factions, but accept them, right? Yeah. There are different interest groups, different factions, different religious and civil groups, all of that. People in their free daily life will simply organize themselves into different groups of interest and factions. And what we should do instead of having a small republic is having a vast republic. This is the great imagination that allows one to think of a continental republic, a federal union that can not just extend from Georgia to New Hampshire, but can extend across the continent and even overseas if need be, where you can keep including more people. The greater the civil society you have, the greater reign you have for the free relations of daily life, the greater reign you have for unsocial sociability, the more diverse interests and groups will form. No major faction will ever compose itself. It can never take control of the elected representative system of the legislature. And even if it attempts to, the federal government will be so divided. It will not have a unicameral legislature. It will have a bicameral legislature. The lower house, the House of Representatives, will be elected on a national basis, as the Federalist Papers say, meaning that it will be proportionate and by districts. You'll divide the whole population of the United States up into co-equal proportionate districts, and they will directly elect every 2 years in a radical democratic actual democracy members of the House of Representatives. But that lower half of the legislature will be balanced by an upper half, which the Federalist Papers calls the federal branch of the legislature, meaning it will not be picked by the people directly, but rather by the states. The state legislatures will elect the senators who go and occupy the Senate. What's more, this bicameral legislature will not have the right to appoint and withdraw judges. Rather, the executive branch will suggest judges, and then the legislature will have to approve it. And the legislature cannot remove them willy-nilly, but must impeach them and remove them through a very high bar. So you're going to have an independent federal judiciary all the way up to the Supreme Court that will serve for life and remain immune to majority opinions, right? And the only way they can be removed is if they commit some awful violations that allow them to be impeached and ultimately removed by the Senate, by supermajorities, right? Likewise, you're not going to have the legislature appoint the governor. You're going to have an independently elected governor. You have an independently elected executive, the president. So the whole genius of the architecture of the federal constitution is basically to do two things: to expand a democratic republic across the great extent of territory, okay? Which means that you will have greater unsocial sociability. You'll have more factions and interests competing against one another. You'll never get a majority permanent interests. And furthermore, you have representative democracy instead of direct democracy, right? Where through elected representative legislatures, the government can be communicated the sense of the people, the sense of society, public opinion. And the federal government will not be this behemoth, this unified behemoth. Rather, it will be an independent executive, the president and the federal executive, the legislature, the Senate and the House of Representatives, and the judiciary, the federal judiciary, all the way up to the Supreme Court. And they will check and balance one another and even compete, claiming that they represent the true interests of society, the general will, against one another, right? And so this is a view, effectively, basically, that you can have an empire of liberty if you embrace, you can have an empire of liberty where political authority does not retard or destroy civil liberty, but rather enlarges and expands civil liberty. And where civil liberty does not undermine, disentangle, dissolve political authority, but actually consolidates and supports political authority. You can have a genuine empire of liberty, a strong federal government, right, capable of defending the country, capable of creating a unified economic space, capable of projecting power overseas, capable of having a unified diplomacy, all of that, that at the same time, nevertheless, is subject and accountable to the civil society over which it rules. A strong federal government, a national state that is responsive, accountable to the sense of the people, the sense of society. Why? Because it has representative democracy, elected lawmakers. And beyond that, it divides up its branches between federal, executive, and judiciary that are competing with one another. And beyond all of that, it has two levels of states. It has a federal state and it has states. So this entire system is designed to basically secure the general will, the general interest of society. You will never get a permanent majority coalition forming, right? That's impossible. You extend the Democratic Republic as far as you can. And furthermore, you have representative democracy and a divided federal government between executive, legislature, and judiciary. And you have divided layers of government between state and federal, all competing against one another. Okay? And that will secure a strong national state, federal government, that nevertheless remains accountable to, responsive to the society over which it rules. That nevertheless, a strong and powerful political authority that can maintain internal order and external defense and even project power at great lengths, right, overseas and over the continent, but nevertheless is subject to the general will, the general interest of society, that is responsive and accountable to the society over which it governs. And what we have to realize, just like I'm saying we have to give conservative Whigs and new Tories a bit of credit, we shouldn't be presentist. We should realize that basically the way that the American revolutionaries were trying to expand political and civil liberty might have undermined all power in government and led to anarchy. Just like I'm saying we can't be presentist. We know what happened, that it worked out. So we can simply just say, oh, these conservative Whigs, new Tories are horrible. No, they were good 18th century Whigs. They wanted to balance power and liberty. And they thought that if you went too far with political liberty, if you went too far with representation, if you went too far with civil liberty, if you went too far with the freedom of society, you would undermine power and have anarchy. You would have no government. Likewise, we also need to credit the anti-federalists. We shouldn't be presentists. The anti-federalists feared that creating this new national government, this gigantic continent-wide union, federal union, never been created before, was going to be an incredible danger. That creating this powerful federal union with a huge national super government that went over all the state governments, that would eventually become a fiscal and military behemoth even greater than the British Empire and would destroy the freedom of society and the freedom of individuals. We live on the other side of this transformation. We know the Federalists, not the Federalists against the Democratic Republicans, but the Federalists against the Anti-Federalists were proved right, that this worked, right? But we should, I think, try and get in the moment of the conservative Whigs turned new Tories who thought too much liberty would destroy any possibility of power, and in the mind of the anti-federalists who thought too much power would destroy any possibility of liberty. What that red line of the American revolutionaries, what they achieve by resisting Britain, by demanding reform, by ultimately hitting the escape hatch through revolution, then constructively building their own Republican state institutions and realizing they went too far and risk tyranny in the majority, and then creating whole new state constitutions and a federal constitution that basically, while keeping conceptually, ideally, power in the people, the sovereignty and the authority of the people, they nevertheless divided and broke up that sovereignty between competing systems of state and federal, between branches of the federal government, judicial, legislative, and executive, and by making it based on not direct democracy and ancient liberty, but representative democracy and civil or modern liberty. Because they did that, they effectively created a balance between power and liberty, where power enriched and expanded liberty, and liberty strengthened and reinforced power. We live on the other side of that. It's a remarkable thing. There's no reason to think, right? There was no reason to think in 1760 that you could ever have a political order that allowed for as much freedom of society and freedom of the individual as the early United States did. Likewise, there was no reason to think you could ever have a powerful system that, while not encroaching on the freedom of society and the freedom of the individual, could nevertheless well defend its borders, could nevertheless, if need be, project power around the world, even defeat the crowned heads of the Western world if need be. There was no reason to think that, right? But that red thread of the American Revolution that we follow through, the likes of James Madison and James Wilson and Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton and George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, right? That red thread are the reason why those people we can call the revolutionaries with a capital R is they go from the colonial American resistance movement all the way to the federal Constitution with this one goal to finally secure an empire of liberty where liberty, civil liberty, the freedom of society of individuals continues to expand in a way that doesn't undermine but rather strengthens power and authority. And power and authority continues to strengthen without undermining liberty, civil liberty, freedom of society, freedom of individuals, but rather expands, enriches, enlarges it.
Very good. Well, James, we're at 3 hours, so that really did tie it together. I'm impressed. Going from the crisis of the imperial crisis and the resolution of that as the unleashing of unsocial sociability, that the genius of the architecture is dealing with the modern social question of how to enable the very dynamism of free individual liberty, right? Because when you do have individual liberty, it's not about you as an individual either. It's precise, it's creating a social object that goes beyond you when everybody is free and individual. And so all of the competing interests that are being channeled by this is precisely that dynamic aspect of the revolution of free labor that certainly no Marxist would want to hamper, right? That's certainly because very often, especially with the progressive Bonapartist state, we want to kill precisely that thing that is dynamic and gives life to society. Right, we want to, but it's like no, it's precisely the competition of interests. It is precisely the perpetual renegotiation of factions and new kinds of industry that is dynamic and that allows society to transform itself.
That's right. That's right. And if I could I know if your patience and the patience of the audience will bear with me, can I give you a concluding quote which actually just underscores your exact point?
Please do. So
in the debates over ratifying the federal constitution, in the debates between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, it's not just the Federalist Papers. All of civil society is participating, meaning many people throughout the 13 colonies now become independent Republican states are publishing papers, periodicals, news magazines for and against the ratification of the federal constitution. And the real site of contention is going to be in New York State. It's going to be in New York State because New York State is a huge state. And New York State, basically, the Anti-Federalists are in the lead. And if the state ratifying convention in New York doesn't ratify the Constitution, and the Anti-Federalists win, you essentially are going to create a split between Virginia in the South and New England, right? Because if New York, New Jersey don't go for it, you won't have a territorially contiguous union. So although in the federal, if you read the Constitution of the United States at the end, you see once 9 states ratify this, it goes into effect. But really, you need the mid-Atlantic, because otherwise New England and the South are not going to be together. They're not worried about Virginia or Massachusetts. There, the Federalists are going to win out. Those are the 2 most important states in 1787, Virginia and Massachusetts, and they're going to bring probably the wider South and New England with them. But they're worried about the Mid-Atlantic, particularly New York. So the debate over the New York ratifying convention is important. We have the Federalist Papers because the Virginian James Madison and the New Yorkers Alexander Hamilton and John Jay are shitting bricks. And they're worried that the Anti-Federalists are going to win the vote to elect the delegates to the state ratifying convention, and thus at the ratifying convention they're going to refuse to ratify the Constitution. So they write by burning the candle at both ends, what late 18th century meant by what we mean by all-nighters. They performed all-nighters and wrote the Federalist Papers. But there were many other people contributing. And so this is a long setup to an article published under the pseudonym Americanus by the New Jersey lawyer John Stevens Jr. And he's writing this in the New York Daily Advertiser in the fall of 1787, trying to influence public opinion, trying to influence the reading public to elect delegates who are more Federalist in inclination, more likely to ratify the federal Constitution at the New York State Convention. Okay? That's the scene of battle. And I just have to read you what he writes because I think it beautifully captures the point you're making. He writes, I have already remarked that a republic confined to a small territory must, from its own nature, be incident to great inconvenience. Faction, instability, and frequent revolutions are inherent properties. Meaning he's agreeing at the very same time Madison, Hamilton, and Jay are writing their defense of the federal Constitution, somebody who wasn't at the who wasn't at the Constitutional Convention. John Stevens Jr., just a lawyer and inventor in New Jersey. He wasn't at the convention in Philadelphia. He's just reading the Constitution as it's been published in the colonial or state newspapers. And he basically sees what's going on here. He didn't need to be there. He doesn't need to be in the mind of Jefferson of Madison or Wilson or Hamilton or Jay or any of these people. He gets it. He writes, faction, instability, and frequent revolutions are inherent properties, meaning they destroy traditional republics, small republics. He writes, besides that its weakness exposes it to continual danger from the enterprises of ambitious neighbors, meaning small republics can get overrun by bigger monarchies and empires. Now, here's the rub of what he says. He says, what a capital improvement, then, is representation to a republican government. By this simple expedient can the sense of the people of an extensive empire be collected with ease and certainty. By this admirable contrivance, the care and attention of government is extended equally to every part. The wants and wishes of the most remote corners are known and attended to. But what is of infinite importance, a government on this plan can be so constructed as that the different parts of it shall form mutual checks on each other. Meaning he's saying not only do we need to use representative democracy against direct democracy, but we also need to divide up government, create checks and balances, so we don't have concentrated political authority. He says a government on this plan can be so constructed as that the different parts of it shall form mutual checks on each other. This is not all. A number of lesser communities may be united under one head and thus form an extensive empire. But this new combination will give still greater security to liberty because more checks will be added. The government of the Union and those of the states individually will be watchful sentinels on the conduct of each other. By this means, the usurpations of power are guarded against and liberty secured without the interference of the collective body of the people. Get that? He's saying you don't need direct democracy because you have representative democracy. And you don't have to worry about representative democracy becoming tyrannous because at the federal level, you're going to divide it up and there's going to be different branches, federal, judicial, executive, and furthermore, there's going to be different levels of government between federal and state checking on one another and appealing to this ideal sovereignty or authority of the people as a whole. Now, Clint, this goes to your last point, I promise. I know I'm probably treading on your patience. And he says, why is all this important? He writes, here then we have that great desideratum that has hitherto been wanting in all the popular governments of the world we are acquainted with, that the people may repose confidence in government without danger of its being abused. As these representatives are chosen only for a short period, at the expiration of which they are again reduced to the level of their fellow citizens, and as during their continuance in this service, they are absolutely prohibited from interfering in any of the executive branches of the government, thus it becoming impossible for them to form an interest separate from that of the community at large, they can have no motive whatever for betraying that of their constituents. And here's the beauty of it, Clint. A government formed on this plan requires in the execution of it none of those heroic virtues which we admire in the ancients, and to us are known only by old stories. The sacrifice of our dearest interests, self-denial, and austerity of manners are by no means any longer necessary. We don't need ancient liberty. We don't need ancient virtue. Such a government requires nothing more of its subjects than that they should study and pursue merely their own true interest and happiness. Right? Okay? We never have to worry. We never have to worry about agreeing on what the collective good or happiness is and imposing it all one on another. In this new Republican government modeled around representative democracy and divided sovereignty, checks and balances between different branches of the federal government, between the federal and state governments across the vast expanse of territory where you've increased unsocial sociability, you've increased competition, interests and factions playing it out. In this world, you don't have to worry about government. Read the newspapers, read pamphlets. If you don't like your elected representative, wait till the next 2 years to vote him out. It's always a him in that period. But in the meantime, what you have is civil liberty. Just go about your life independently with your family, with others, and figure out what is the good you want to live to. Figure out your own happiness. As he so beautifully puts it, right? That the subjects are now free to study and pursue merely their own true interest and happiness, right? And that ultimately is why the ratification of the Constitution is not a counter-revolution, but it's the fulfillment of the American Revolution. It's the fulfillment of those ideals passed by the Second Continental Congress on July 2nd, 1776, and proclaimed by George Washington, the Continental Army, on July 4th, 1776. Those ideals we're going to celebrate tomorrow have at their core the idea of the pursuit of happiness. Freely in society, right? By people individually, collectively in society, figuring out on their own how to set the course of their own existence, figuring out what good really is, what happiness really is, and living according to it, or as it may change and transform over time. That pursuit of happiness, only that desideratum that Jefferson and the Second Continental Congress announced tomorrow on July 4th, was only fully achieved. Those revolutionary aspirations were only achieved with the passage and enactment of the federal Constitution in 1788, because it was only there that really a political order adequate to allow people the scope for civil liberty, for freedom of society, as that author put it, to pursue, to determine and figure out as they see best their own interest and their own happiness. So the desideratum of the Declaration of Independence, right, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, are really only fully achieved in the new federal government put in place in 1788. And that's why the Constitution is the fulfillment of the American Revolution and not a counter-revolution. It is the living embodiment of the American Revolution. And as a written Constitution, it is the way that we as the present generation constantly think about and negotiate with the past generations of the United States, right? In order to basically, right, transform that document. Meaning the written Constitution is the way we kind of collectively, as citizens of the United States, negotiate our relationship with the American Revolution, right? How we transform this society that is supposed to be ultimately self-governing, not in the sense of political liberty, mass democracy, but in a sense of a society where people individually and collectively set the course of their own existence. And the written constitution is basically the living institutional embodiment of the revolution. It's the document by which, in deliberating, debating, and changing, right, amending, we constantly negotiate that project of the American Revolution with the actual population as it presently exists in its current social, economic, demographic, cultural circumstances.
Not a country with a revolution, but a revolution with a country.
Yes. Yes, precisely.
All right. Happy 4th.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.